Imagine trying to flirt without speaking, or smiling too much, or even looking for longer than a polite sneeze. Welcome to dating in the Victorian era, where passion wore a top hat, emotions were censored harder than a scandalous ankle, and the hottest thing you could do was accidentally touch gloves during a group waltz. This was an age where courtship wasn't about swiping right. It was about surviving a silent 14-month-long conversation, conducted entirely through folded fans, floral arrangements, and soul-crushing social rules. Love wasn't spontaneous. It was scheduled, supervised, and served with a side of lukewarm tea. You didn't just fall in love, you applied for it, got references, filed paperwork, and waited for your designated visiting hour, all while being silently judged by someone's aunt in the corner. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The good news? You're about to learn the sacred art of Victorian romance. The bad news? You're already standing way too close. Step back. There's a chaperone watching. Forget Tinder. In Victorian Britain, romance was a full-contact sport, minus the contact. It was social chess, played with gloves on, in full formal wear, while a chaperone judged your every move like a hawk in lace. Let's start with the basics. How to not get exiled from polite society in 3 easy steps. Step 1. Lock eyes. Lose reputation eye contact. Something we modern folks use to flirt, connect, or awkwardly stare at the barista while trying to remember how to say grand. In Victorian times, eye contact was practically an engagement announcement. If a man looked too long at a woman, it wasn't charming, it was scandalous. A prolonged glance could suggest attraction. A smile? Absolute chaos. And if you dared to speak to a woman you hadn't been properly introduced to, you might as well start packing for a shame-fueled trip to a remote sheep farm in Scotland. In public, the correct behavior was to appear entirely uninterested in the opposite sex, even if your soul screamed otherwise. Think, flirting through aggressively looking away. It was less, I saw her across the room, and more, our eyes briefly met across the room, and now I must marry her, or die of honor. Step 2. Chaperones. Because love needs surveillance, enter the chaperone. The unsung hero or fun sponge of Victorian romance. Typically an older woman, often a relative, she existed solely to ensure that absolutely nothing romantic happened during a romantic encounter. And think of her as a personal romance security guard. Your date, supervised. Your walk through the park, observed. Your attempt to whisper sweet nothings, drowned out by a loud throat clear, and an aggressive repositioning of a parasol. The logic was simple. If a young lady was alone with a man, the odds of her reputation combusting on the spot rose dramatically. Chaperones were there to stop hands from straying, lips from moving, and even emotions from developing too rapidly. Romance in the Victorian era was like a chemistry experiment in a glass box, sterile, supervised, and potentially explosive if mishandled. Step 3. The art of calling, romantic scheduling for the terminally polite. So you've locked eyes, haven't said anything wildly inappropriate, like hello, and somehow passed the chaperone gauntlet. What next? You call on her. This isn't a phone call, it's a literal visit, an arranged, scheduled, daytime appearance at the lady's house, during a designated window called calling hours, usually between 3 o'clock and 5 p.m, not earlier, or you were rude, not later, or you were scandalous. Welcome to Victorian romance, powered by punctuality and parental oversight. But wait, you couldn't just show up uninvited. No, that would be social suicide. You had to be introduced by a mutual acquaintance, ideally someone already respected by the family. Think of it as needing a character reference to even knock on the front door. Once you arrived with flowers, of course, not for the lady, but for her mother, you'd be shown to the drawing room and allowed a brief conversation. Very brief. 5 to 10 minutes of peak Victorian flirting, small talk, weather observations, and maybe, just maybe, a comment about the tea. Every word was monitored, every gesture judged. If you left too quickly, you were cold. If you stayed too long, you were presumptuous. If you sat before she sat, social Armageddon. If the lady liked you, her family might return the gesture by leaving a card at your house, the 1800s version of he liked your post back. And just like that, you were in what we now call a situationship, only with formal wear, and 10 times the risk of ruining your life over a misplaced compliment. Bonus rule. Emotions are for peasants. Victorian society prized restraint. Passion was fine in novels, where heroines fainted in the moors and men brooded in waistcoats. But in real life, emotion was a bit common. A proper gentleman expressed interest through politeness, predictability, and rigid posture. A lady, in return, smiled demurely, looked vaguely amused by everything, and avoided anything that smelled like spontaneity. You weren't allowed to say "I love you" on the first date. You were barely allowed to admit you'd read a book about love. In summary, Victorian dating was like being in a long job interview, one where your resume was your family name, your GPA was your father's income, and your main qualification was how well you could nod without accidentally being seductive. So the next time you're on a bad date, remember, at least no one is measuring the distance between you and your crush with a ruler, and no one's aunt is hissing. 6 inches apart, Charles. 6 inches. Because in the Victorian era, love might have been eternal, but only if it wore gloves, knocked politely, and didn't breathe too heavily near the porcelain. Welcome to the Covert Operations Division of Victorian Romance. Flirting, where saying the wrong thing could ruin your reputation, but saying anything might ruin it faster. If you think dating today is confusing, try decoding a woman's intentions using only the flutter of a hand fan and a carnation shoved into a lapel. It was less, "I like you," and more, "I've arranged my gloves in a way that spells emotional availability." Victorian flirting was a strategic battle of innuendo, objects, and socially approved eyebrow raises. Talking? Absolutely not. Flirting in the open? Practically criminal. No, romance in the 1800s was an encrypted, low-volume, high-risk affair. Basically Morse code in lace. Let's break it down. 1 passive-aggressive accessory at a time. 1 fan language. The original flirtation app are the hand fan. Delicate, decorative, and somehow more powerful than the spoken word. Victorian ladies wielded fans the way modern people use texting for coded, deniable, plausible flirting. There was an entire fan language, with each motion representing a different message. Holding the fan in the right hand in front of the face, "Follow me." Holding it in the left hand, "I'm desirous of your acquaintance." Fanning slowly, "I'm married." Back off. Fanning quickly, "I'm single, and my parents are conveniently looking the other way. And heaven help you if you dropped your fan." That wasn't just clumsiness. It was practically a marriage proposal, unless it slipped from the left hand, in which case it meant we should just be friends. Unless you were wearing gloves, then it meant, "I hate your waistcoat." The takeaway? If your romantic fate hinged on a woman's wrist, flicking a decorated paddle around, you'd better pay attention. 1 misinterpretation, and you were either eloping or being chased off the lawn with a walking stick. 2. Glove language. Because why just wear accessories when you can weaponize them? Gloves weren't just for keeping your hands clean. They were romantic semaphores, broadcasting emotional states through the power of fabric positioning. Wearing 1 glove and holding the other in your hand, "I wish to be alone with you." Tapping your gloves against your hand, "Be careful, I'm watching you." Dropping a glove intentionally was a way of saying, "I hope you pick this up, along with my heart." Unless it was done carelessly, in which case it might mean my maid packed poorly. And if a woman slowly, sensually pulled on her glove in public, that was about as scandalous as Victorian things got. People would whisper, aunts would faint, horses might bolt. It was glove-rated. R for men. Glove etiquette was just as complex. You didn't shake hands with your gloves on, unless you were issuing a challenge or trying to make an enemy for life. You didn't remove your gloves too early, or you were seen as overly familiar. Too late, and you were cold and aloof. Victorian gloves, because making anyone comfortable was strictly forbidden. 3. Flower language. The botany of romance. Victorians were obsessed with floriography, the secret language of flowers. You didn't just give someone a bouquet, you gave them a complex sentence made out of stems and petals. Red roses for love, yellow for jealousy, lilies for purity, and gardenias for I secretly adore you, but am also battling tuberculosis. There were entire guides published explaining how to speak bouquet. You could give someone a single bloom and change your whole romantic trajectory. A lady might pin a particular flower to her dress during a ball to signal availability, or send a message through her corsage that said, in effect, "Yes, I'm into you, but only between the hours of 3 and 5 p.m. while my chaperone is looking away." But the danger of this system, interpretation. Imagine receiving a daffodil. Does that mean new beginnings? Or is she calling you narcissistic? You hand someone a lavender sprig, thinking it means devotion. They look horrified, because to them, it symbolizes distrust. Congratulations, you've just been dumped in 3 syllables of botanical confusion. 4. The handkerchief drop. Victorian seduction. 101. The classic move, a lady drops her handkerchief in front of a gentleman. He picks it up, she thanks him, and boom. A socially acceptable, physically adjacent, mildly flirty moment has occurred. This was the only time physical proximity was allowed to even flirt with being flirtatious. The handkerchief drop was like sending a Victorian DM direct, subtle, and deniable if it went poorly. Did she drop it on purpose? Maybe. Did you mean to step on it while picking it up and accidentally tear it? Probably. Congratulations. You just ruined her reputation and your chances. Even more dangerous, trying to say something while returning it. Because here's the final rule. 5. Verbal flirting. Only if you've written a will. Speaking aloud was a dicey move. Language was a minefield. And even innocent remarks could be misinterpreted as proposals, insults, or signs of moral decay. Saying "you look lovely today" could lead to weeks of whispered gossip. Complimenting her dress. Brazen. Asking her favorite book. Indecent. Especially if it was a novel. Especially if it had French words in it. In polite society, silence was sexier than speech. If you had to say anything, say it with a stammer, a bow, and an apology. Victorian flirting was like diffusing a bomb with oven mitts. You had one chance to get it right, and absolutely no instructions. Forget talking, forget touching. You communicated your romantic interest through accessories, flower petals, and the way you positioned your thumbs. So the next time you're struggling to write the perfect flirty text, just be glad you don't need to learn the difference between "I like you" and "please never speak to me again," using only fern arrangements and embroidered napkins. Because in the Victorian era, flirting wasn't a conversation, it was a performance, and one dropped glove away from complete social annihilation. Before the age of heart emojis and "ooh up" texts, there was the Victorian love letter, an art form, a therapy session, and occasionally, a full-blown emotional dissertation. In an era where PDA meant "please don't acknowledge," and courting was more cryptic than a Shakespearean riddle, writing a letter was the only way to let your beloved know that your soul was crumbling in their absence, and that you noticed how nicely the rain framed the hollyhocks yesterday. This was not light correspondence. This was romantic long-form, and it was deadly serious. 1. When in love, write like you're competing for a Pulitzer. Victorians didn't just write love letters, they poured their souls into them, sealed the envelope with longing, and possibly wept into the ink for good measure. A single letter could span multiple pages, with elaborately curved cursive that looked like a spider had a breakdown after reading Byron. "My dearest Clarabelle," it might begin. "Since the moment we last parted upon the garden path beneath the weeping willow, I have known no joy." That's sentence 1. You're only 12 more pages away from the signature. A proper Victorian love letter contained a thorough update on one's emotional devastation, a casual mention of the weather seriously. Stormy skies were romantic metaphors, not just small talk. At least one obscure literary reference. If you weren't quoting Tennyson, were you even in love? And finally, a slightly tortured closing line, such as "yours in eternal agony and anticipation, Algernon." These weren't letters, they were romantic novellas, composed with the hope that the recipient would swoon, cry, and possibly knit you a commemorative scarf. 2. The postal system, Tinder. But with horsepower, you might think this would all fall apart due to the glacial pace of 19th century communication. But oh no, the Victorian postal system was scarily efficient. In cities like London, you could get up to 12 deliveries a day. That meant a letter could be sent, read, responded to, and answered again before tea. It was the equivalent of checking your DMs constantly. Courting couples would volley letters back and forth throughout the day. Wake up, write, mid-morning, write again. Post-lunch and digestion slump. Time to remind Beatrice that her absence gnaws at your spleen. The postman was less a government employee and more a wingman. He knew your secrets. He saw the fragrant sealed envelopes, and he definitely judged you when you mailed 5 letters in one afternoon that all ended with yours forever in damp-hearted despair. For those living farther away, it got trickier. You might wait days or weeks for a response. During that time, lovers would pine, fret, and reread old letters until they'd memorized the flourishes in their beloved's signature. Some even slept with letters under their pillows. Because who needs emotional stability when you've got paper soaked in rosewater? 3. The secret language of ink, flowers, and fabric scraps. Because the Victorians couldn't just say what they meant, heaven forbid, they added secret messages to their letters, turning each piece of mail into a romantic escape room. Some examples. Invisible ink. Lemon juice was used to write messages only visible under heat. These often included scandalous lines like, "I long for your presence at Thursday's promenade. Your collar was most agreeable last Sunday." Pressed flowers. Not just a gift. Each flower carried a coded meaning. A pansy meant, "I'm thinking of you," while rosemary was for remembrance. A sprig of basil, hatred. Let's hope they checked the chart twice. Fabric fragments. Sometimes, a corner of lace or a scrap of ribbon would be enclosed, just enough to send the recipient into emotional meltdown. "She touched this," they'd whisper, before fainting into a pile of cravat catalogues. There were even puzzle purses, elaborately folded notes that, when unfolded properly, revealed a poem or secret message. Misfold it, and you might accidentally declare war instead of love. Tragic, but decorative. 4. Handwriting. The 19th century personality test, Victorian calligraphy, wasn't just legible, it was evaluated. Lovers would analyze handwriting the way we analyze texts today. A large, sweeping loop, romantic soul. Tight, spidery script. Emotionally repressed, but likely good at saving money. There were even guides to interpreting handwriting personality traits. If your G-tails drooped too much, it was a sign of depression. A confident Q was borderline erotic. Some lovers even learned each other's handwriting styles so well they could spot a forged letter a mile away. Cheaters weren't using burner phones. They were trying to replicate someone else's cursive with a fountain pen, while hoping not to betray their lack of emotional punctuation. 5. The ultimate emotional investment. Sending a love letter in the Victorian age wasn't quick. It wasn't easy. It was a commitment. You had to gather the right stationery, write with the proper tone, poetic but not desperate, sign it with a flourish, seal it with wax, and pray you didn't spill ink and look unhinged. And after all that, your recipient might take days to reply. Or worse, send your letter back, unopened, with a note from her father saying, "Cease this madness. She is betrothed. Kindly evaporate." But when it worked, when the postman handed you a thick envelope that smelled faintly of lavender and longing, that was pure Victorian dopamine. For the Victorians, love wasn't fast or casual. It was epistolary warfare, a paper trail of passion, longing, metaphors, and occasional flower pressings. Every letter was a carefully wrapped emotional package, delivered not with a buzz or a ping, but with hoofbeats and hope. So next time you send a one-line "Hey," remember, somewhere in 1873, a man just spent 4 hours drafting a sonnet about how a woman's elbow ruined his sleep cycle. Now that's commitment. Now you may have thought Victorian romance was all eye contact and pressed violets. But let's be honest, you were never just courting a person. You were auditioning for a role in their family's financial future, especially in the eyes of her mother, who regarded love with the same tenderness one uses to examine a mortgage application. To understand Victorian dating, you must understand the romantic iron curtain that was the Victorian parent, usually the mother, sometimes the father, always terrifying. At its core, Victorian marriage was less about passion and more about portfolio diversification. It was like two families merging stocks, except the dividends were grandchildren, and the liabilities included scandal and gout. If you were a young man seeking a bride, you'd better come prepared with land, prospects, and at least the illusion of not being a financial black hole. Romantic feelings were nice, but income statements were better. A suitor with good breeding and a moderately promising inheritance could expect warmer receptions, but a charming rogue with no income, he might be offered a glass of water at the door, right before it was thrown in his face. And for women, it was even trickier. A proper Victorian lady was often expected to bring a dowry, which was essentially her parents handing over a chunk of wealth to make her more appealing. Imagine paying someone to marry your daughter and still hoping they don't run off with a governess 3 months in. Dowries varied by class. An upper-middle-class girl might bring enough for a small estate. A working-class woman might bring some linens, a cow, or a disturbingly detailed needlepoint sampler. Either way, marriage wasn't about two hearts. It was about two bank ledgers learning to cohabitate. In this delicate game of matchmaking, the Victorian mother was the referee, bouncer, and unpaid HR manager. She did not trust your face. She did not trust your handshake. She especially did not trust your intentions regarding her daughter's ankle. She curated courtship opportunities like a museum director, deciding which suitor could briefly tour the impressionist exhibit. When she invited you to tea, she wasn't being friendly. She was conducting a background check. Expect questions like, "And what are your future prospects, Mr. Witherspoon? Your uncle was the one with the gambling debts. Yes? Have you ever fainted while handling pheasants?" A poor answer could lead to an abrupt removal from the suitor list. A great answer might still be met with a raised eyebrow and a quick glance at the family's coat of arms. Even if the daughter swooned at your poetry, nothing moved forward without maternal blessing. The mother wasn't just a guardian of her daughter's virtue. She was the CEO of her daughter's marital future, and she preferred her son-in-law to come with a title, at least 3 waistcoats, and a notable absence of scandal. While the mother was busy scrutinizing your intentions through her lorgnette, the father played a more shadowy role. He was often the human embodiment of a loan officer, emotionally distant but deeply invested in whether you could support his daughter and not embarrass the family crest. He might not speak much during your visits, but rest assured, he was judging you harder than a carriage horse at the royal escort. Did you cross your legs like a socialist? Did you refer to farming as a bit rustic? Did you blink too often? All noted. If the daughter's happiness was theoretically important, it still ranked below concerns like inheritance law, property boundaries, and whether your last name sounded sufficiently un-French. Victorians had a mild obsession with genetics, even before they knew what DNA was. They believed character traits, intelligence, and even moral fiber could be passed down like curly hair or weak ankles. So when a family selected a suitor, it wasn't just about class, it was about eugenic optimism. Was your family line free of madness, gout, debt, and scandalous cousins? Congratulations. You're eligible for round 2. This also led to some genuinely awkward matchmaking conversations. Mothers might praise a suitor's fine bone structure or robust lungs, as if shopping for livestock. Fathers might inquire about an aunt's history with tuberculosis, because nothing says love like a casual dip into your ancestral medical records. It was matchmaking by spreadsheet. A potential partner was evaluated not by how kind they were, but by how well they'd upgrade the family line. Imagine romantic success, based entirely on the width of your skull and whether your uncle once invented a steam-powered potato peeler. That's Victorian dating. Now, not every Victorian marriage was a soulless economic alliance. Some couples genuinely fell in love, but that was a fortunate side effect, not the primary goal. If you could both afford each other, didn't come from a disgraced bloodline, and weren't alarmingly attached to poetry, your chances were good. And if the mother liked you, even better. But if she didn't, it didn't matter if the daughter was doodling your initials in the margins of her prayer book. Your romantic career was over before it began. Sometimes love conquered all, but more often, it had to submit a formal request, prove its income, and schedule a meeting with the matriarch. Victorian dating wasn't just personal, it was parental. You weren't trying to win over one heart, you were trying to pass a boardroom interview disguised as afternoon tea. The stakes were high, the expectations higher, and the only real wild card was whether her mother thought your sideburns were dashing or aggressively lower class. So if you're planning to time travel to the 1800s in pursuit of romance, just remember, it's not enough to woo the daughter. You better also bring flowers, finances, and a very flattering genealogy chart, because you're dating the whole family. When you think of romantic gifts, your mind probably jumps to roses, chocolates, maybe a sentimental playlist. But if you were a Victorian suitor, trying to say, "I adore you" without actually saying anything out loud, because God forbid you be direct, your toolbox was a little more eccentric. Victorian courtship gifts weren't just tokens of affection, they were encrypted love letters, abstract art installations, and sometimes a tiny bit gross. But in a time when physical intimacy was limited to meaningful glances and sitting on the same side of a piano bench, scandalous. These gifts were how people screamed, "I love you," in the most decorously repressed way possible. Let's start with the undisputed heavyweight champion of Victorian romance, the lock of hair. Today, gifting someone your hair might raise more red flags than heart rates, but in the 1800s, it was practically Cupid's currency. If a Victorian woman gave you a snippet of her tresses, she was basically handing you her soul. Men, too, sometimes sent a tightly curled lock nestled in a locket, often accompanied by a note that could easily double as a chapter from a Gothic novel. The locket might be worn near the heart, which sounds sweet, until you remember this is literally carrying around someone's severed DNA in a decorative tin. More extreme examples included braided hair jewelry, like rings and bracelets woven from a loved one's strands. Creepy? A bit. But back then, nothing said eternal devotion like handcrafted follicular fashion. Victorians didn't just give gifts. They curated experiences. Each item was a deeply symbolic artifact wrapped in 17 layers of metaphor. It wasn't just a gift. It was a puzzle box of meaning. A pressed violet meant faithfulness. An acrostic brooch using gemstones like ruby, emerald, garnet, amethyst, ruby, diamond, regard was basically spelling out, "I like you." Even mundane objects were dripping with double meaning. A miniature shoe might symbolize a desire to walk together through life, while a needle point of a lighthouse might say, "You're my guiding light." Or perhaps, "Your dad owns shipping routes, and I find that attractive." Sometimes couples exchanged coin purses, not for the money but as a sign they trusted each other not to squander it, because nothing fuels romance like subtle economic responsibility. These keepsakes were often lovingly handmade, filled with secret compartments, or accompanied by poetry. So much poetry. And if you failed to interpret them correctly, well, tough luck. You just accidentally proposed marriage when all she meant was, "You have nice handwriting." Victorians loved nature. They also loved killing nature and putting it under glass. This is how we arrive at the bizarre but very real courtship trend of giving someone a stuffed bird as a romantic gift. Now, before you imagine handing your crush a floppy pigeon, understand this was a decorated and aesthetic affair. Birds were carefully preserved, arranged in elaborate domes with feathers fluffed and eyes unnaturally bright, usually perched atop a velvet cushion or staring longingly into the distance. And what did it mean? Probably something about eternal beauty, fragile love, or the grace of flight. Or maybe it just said, "I noticed you enjoy small, dead animals." This wasn't limited to birds. Victorians pressed butterflies, framed beetles, and occasionally gifted tiny mammals in scenes that somehow managed to be both romantic and slightly cursed. These weren't gag gifts. These were heartfelt gestures, and if she didn't swoon over your meticulously preserved vole, she probably wasn't the one. If taxidermy wasn't your thing, you could always go for the less dead, but still lifeless, pressed flower. Flowers were the original emotional emojis of the Victorian era. But in a world where eye contact was loaded, giving a full bouquet could be a lot. So enter the pressed flower, elegant, delicate, and symbolic. These would be placed in books, lockets, letters, or framed behind glass. A pansy said, "I'm thinking of you." A forget-me-not was basically "ooh up," written in petal form. And heaven help the poor soul who gave a marigold grief when they meant to offer a daisy innocence and hope. One botanical blunder and you'd emotionally propose mourning instead of marriage. If there was one thing a Victorian romantic couldn't resist, it was writing dangerously long poetry. Even if your metaphor game was weaker than cold tea, you were expected to produce, at minimum, a few stanzas of heartfelt agony. Most suitors, however, treated this like a competitive sport. One-upmanship in poetic courtship was real. Roses or red would not cut it. We're talking entire epics about her hair, your longing, and a metaphor involving swans, moonlight, and possibly tubercular sighs. If you couldn't write it yourself, no problem. You could copy it from Lord Byron or Tennyson, and just hope she didn't notice. Plagiarism was the sincerest form of flattery, but even the sincerest poem could backfire. A particularly overwrought verse might make her laugh, or worse, invoke a polite, but soul-crushing, "How lovely." Translation: she's about to marry the barrister with a shorter sonnet, but a bigger bank account. In the Victorian dating world, A gift wasn't just a present. It was a coded love letter, artistic statement, and emotional scavenger hunt, all rolled into one. Whether you were giving a pressed daisy or a taxidermy parrot with a tiny ribbon around its neck, what mattered was that it screamed, "I see you, I adore you, and I can afford ornamental birds." So the next time you get a text that just says, "Hey," take a moment to appreciate that at least you didn't have to decipher whether a dead finch under glass meant "kiss me" or "you remind me of my grandmother's wallpaper." In the modern world, a walk is what you do when your car breaks down, or when you're trying to close your fitness ring. But in the Victorian era, a walk with your romantic interest was the ultimate romantic power move. The nuclear option of affection, second only to a formal proposal and possibly spontaneous combustion from too much emotional repression. To the untrained eye, it looked innocent. Just two well-dressed individuals, gliding slowly down a gravel path, parasol in hand, speaking politely about daffodils and barometric pressure. But beneath the lace and top hats, passion simmered like overboiled tea, because in a world where holding hands might summon a bishop, going for a walk was an emotional striptease. Let's be clear, asking someone for a walk wasn't casual. It wasn't the Victorian equivalent of "wanna grab a coffee." It was more like, "I may not legally propose marriage today, but this is a heavily choreographed warm-up act." This wasn't a spontaneous stroll. Oh no, a walk had to be arranged through the proper channels. Letters might be sent, a chaperone alerted, schedules coordinated. You couldn't just knock on her door and say, "Fancy a lap around the hedges." That was street behavior. If a lady accepted your offer to promenade, it implied that she didn't not want to marry you. And in a world where subtle social clues were more binding than contracts, that was huge. The walk was your audition. Equal parts romantic gesture, character witness testimony, and cardiovascular assessment. There were rules. So many rules. First, location. Public parks were preferred, especially ones with wide, visible paths, where wandering clergymen or nosy aunts could easily spot you being non-immoral. Garden paths were excellent for flirtation. Why? Because they had bends, and bends allowed for a few moments of privacy before you re-emerged into moral society. Just enough time to share a knowing glance, a whispered weather observation, or brace yourself, let your fingers accidentally brush. Next, timing. A walk should not be too long, lest it imply physical impropriety, or worse, that you were trying to make her legs strong, which was clearly a gateway to feminist ideas. Nor should it be too short, or it might signal you found her conversational topics on moss deeply uninteresting. 15 to 30 minutes was a safe, flirty sweet spot, and company. You were almost never alone. A chaperone was standard, ideally a matronly figure capable of glowering like a hawk who's seen too many seasons of Bridgerton. Sometimes a younger sibling tagged along, nature's mood killer, whose job was to trail behind and loudly repeat any whispered endearments to the family at dinner. There is no 21st century equivalent for the Victorian hand graze. Forget your Tinder swipes and dating apps. This was raw, unfiltered skin-on-skin drama. If your fingers so much as grazed hers during a walk, the emotional explosion could be felt 3 counties away. You'd both immediately look away, of course, and pretend nothing happened. But your heart was galloping like a startled pony, and she was silently counting the seconds until she could write about it in her journal, using at least 4 Shakespeare quotes and a pressed fern. And if she didn't pull her hand away immediately, congratulations, you were basically engaged. Just give it 6 to 8 weeks for parental negotiations, dowry assessment, and maybe a small bouquet of taxidermy. During these walks, conversation was key. But what could you possibly talk about that wouldn't be too forward, too personal, or too much like suggesting you had emotions? Answer: the weather. Not because it was thrilling, but because it was safe. Weather talk was the Victorian love language, emotionally neutral but brimming with subtext. "It's quite warm today," might mean, "My love burns like the August sun." A bit of rain earlier was code for, "I miss you so terribly, I cried during breakfast." And "the wind has turned" could easily be interpreted as, "My heart beats only for you," and also, "I think I caught a chill." This type of romantic meteorology allowed couples to express longing while technically discussing cloud cover. And the best part? Even if someone overheard, all they'd hear was a thrilling debate about dew points. The walk might have ended, but your trial was just beginning. Once you were home, Everyone talked about it. Her mother analyzed every gesture. Her father made veiled references to your gait. Her great-aunt might even suggest you had a compromising air, which was Victorian for walks like he has opinions. For you, the next 24 hours were a nerve-wracking swirl of hope and dread. Did she smile more than usual? Did she compliment your waistcoat? Did you walk too fast? Did you dare mention birdsong in a way that suggested impure thoughts? And if, God forbid, you didn't get invited for a second walk, you might as well go buy a beard comb and start reading about colonial shipping routes, because you were clearly destined to die alone. The Victorian walk wasn't exercise. It was a ritual, a performance, a slow-motion, high-stakes emotional game of chess, played with parasols and polite commentary about wind direction. One wrong move, and you were socially doomed. One right move, and you were halfway to legally obligated matrimony. So the next time you see an old painting of a man and woman walking slowly through a garden, remember, they're not bored, they're flirting like their lives and reputations depend on it. And somewhere, a chaperone with murder in her eyes is watching from the shadows. Engagement. The sacred midpoint between I find your company tolerable until death or tuberculosis do us part. In theory, it was a joyful affair, a symbol of romantic triumph. But in the Victorian world, it was also a social landmine with a long fuse and an audience of nosy neighbours eager to light it. And sometimes you had to keep it secret. Not just hush-hush. We're talking cloak and dagger. Don't make eye contact in church. Pretend you're just cousins at the picnic secret. Because nothing in Victorian society spread faster than scandal, except maybe syphilis and rumours about Lord Fotheringay's moustache wax addiction. First and foremost, class warfare. If you were upper class and got engaged to someone even slightly below you, say, a merchant's daughter, instead of a landowning debutante, your family would react like you'd just announced your engagement to a barn owl. Your parents might disown you. Your name could be whispered in salons as that girl with ideas. So to avoid social suicide, many couples entered secret engagements. They planned to announce the relationship once the lower status party miraculously proved themselves, which usually meant inheriting something or mastering the art of not being noticed. Another reason? Unapproved timing. If the couple was too young, too financially unstable, or if the moon was in the wrong emotional phase, families might delay the announcement until all planets and bank accounts aligned. Young love had to be tempered with parental micromanagement, after all. And let's not forget previous romantic entanglements. If either party had recently been flirting with someone else, or, heaven forbid, had already broken another engagement, announcing a new one too soon was asking for social combustion. You'd go from eligible to unreliable, faster than you could say handkerchief, miscommunication. Once an engagement was even suspected, the gossip machine kicked into high gear. Forget telegraphs. The real Victorian communication network ran on maids with ears like bats, widows with time, and that one neighbour who always peeked through the curtains just to water the plants. Did you walk together twice in 1 week? Engaged. Did he hand her a flower? Engaged with twins. Did she blush when he entered the room? Clearly pregnant, eloping and hiding royal ancestry. And then came the tea parties. Victorian tea parties weren't about tea. They were tactical briefings. Every woman there had a mental folder full of engagement theories, scandal timelines, and the latest rumours about who was in a delicate situation. One offhand comment from a busybody like Mrs. Featherstone, and suddenly your innocent glance became a torrid affair. If someone saw you emerging from a drawing room, even supervised, expect your reputation to be passed around faster than the scones. And if you were spotted walking in the countryside without a third wheel, that's it. The scandal sirens were already sounding. Once the gossip had festered long enough, it often made the leap from whispered speculation to printed fact. Yes, society papers, early tabloids masquerading as news, had an insatiable appetite for engagements, breakups, and mildly scandalous bonnet choices. These papers didn't wait for confirmations. They ran on pure rumour. If two people were seen in the same carriage more than once, one of them was probably listed in next week's imminent marriages and moral collapses column. And once your engagement, true or otherwise, hit the press, good luck escaping it. Backpedaling after a false announcement was nearly impossible. Even a firm denial only made things worse. So he's denying it. Clearly something did happen. possibly a duel. In fact, the mere appearance of an engagement in print could pressure couples to make it official, lest they be seen as flippant or, heaven forbid, players. Image was everything. Even if the bride-to-be only liked the groom's dog, that was enough for a headline. Lady Evangeline seen smiling at Spaniel. Betrothal imminent. Keeping an engagement secret was risky, but having it revealed was downright explosive. If parents hadn't been informed yet, you could expect a complete domestic meltdown. Shouting matches, fainting spells, and sudden trips to the countryside for one's health were common. For women especially, the damage could be permanent. Even the suspicion of improper behavior or a secret romance could tarnish a reputation beyond repair. She might be labeled fast or imprudent, or worst of all, modern. Men didn't fare much better. They might be seen as deceptive, manipulative, or lacking the essential ingredient of any good Victorian male, the ability to follow endless rules and make boring decisions about wallpaper. Families would get involved. Letters flew, threats of disinheritance loomed, and while couples today might have a rough time explaining a tattoo to grandma, back then you had to explain why your engagement wasn't cleared through 3 social layers, a financial review, and a background check involving how many carriages your grandfather owned. Ultimately, the power of one tiny whisper in the wrong drawing room was enough to unravel lives. You didn't need hard evidence. All you needed was a rumour, a missed curtsy, or someone like Mrs. Featherstone glancing over her lorgnette and whispering, "Did you hear?" That's how courtships collapsed. Engagements imploded, and people ended up living alone with 14 cats and a collection of regretfully returned love tokens. So if you ever found yourself engaged in Victorian England, the smart move wasn't to shout it from the rooftops. The smart move was to whisper it into a handkerchief, bury it under a rosebush, and wait for your mother's astrologer to give the all clear. So your whirlwind Victorian romance has hit the brakes. Perhaps you discovered she preferred long walks with your cousin. Or maybe you realized he'd been sending identical poetry to every woman within a 20-mile radius, and possibly one horse. Either way, congratulations. You're about to experience the most emotionally repressed breakup in history. Breaking up in the Victorian era was less about tears and yelling, and more about delicate wording, emotional constipation, and an unspoken agreement to never make direct eye contact again. This was the age of courtesy laced with cruelty, formality mixed with fire, and a strong belief that even heartbreak should be filtered through lace and lavender-scented stationery. Let's begin with the Victorian equivalent of "It's not you, it's me," only with more cravats. Officially it was called withdrawing one's affections, and it was as vague as it was devastating. No shouting, no accusations, just a polite, murmured suggestion that perhaps your affections had been misplaced, redirected, or, whoops, misfiled under the wrong social class. This was a society where you didn't break hearts. You reorganized romantic assets. If a gentleman decided he no longer wished to pursue a lady, he might simply stop calling. Not calling as in phone calls. Telegraphs weren't exactly buzzing with breakups, but ceasing all visits, ceasing all letter writing, and ceasing all acknowledgement of her existence in social spaces. He didn't dump you. He became a ghost with a top hat. And for women, it was even trickier. To break off a courtship as a lady, one had to be infinitely subtle, because being too direct could damage your own reputation. A woman who ended things too abruptly might be labelled capricious, flighty, or worst of all, in possession of opinions. So she might, for example, stop offering tea. That's right. No tea was basically the equivalent of a restraining order. If she returned your glove without a note, declined your company on a walk, or started talking at length about how she wanted to focus on herself and embroidery, it was over. You'd been dumped, delicately. Now if a direct breakup was necessary, say because of distance, rumours, or a scandal involving a clergyman and a pudding, then it had to be delivered by letter, but not just any letter. A breakup letter so passive-aggressive, it practically wore a monocle. Victorian breakup letters were masterpieces of subtle cruelty. They never said, "I don't love you anymore." Instead, they were crafted with 80% passive voice and 20% vague disappointment. A typical letter might read, "My dearest Algernon, it has occurred to me that our continued correspondence may no longer serve the best intentions of propriety and mutual decorum. I feel, in the most respectful of manners, that the course of our acquaintance has perhaps run parallel to affection rather than through it. Translation: You're boring, and my mother caught you picking your nose. There were layers to these letters, layers that could take 3 readings and a trusted aunt to decode. Some were filled with flowery metaphors, some included gentle critiques of the recipient's moral failings, cloaked in metaphysical imagery, and some simply returned everything the other person had ever given them, like a tiny, morbid breakup time capsule. Returning gifts was the breakup's final ritual. This wasn't just about clearing clutter, it was a symbolic annihilation of the relationship. Everything had to go. Hair lockets, back in your possession, now tangled and vaguely upsetting. Pressed flowers, flattened reminders of your now wilted affection. Tiny paintings, sentimental poetry, perhaps a taxidermied ferret named after her middle name, all returned, wrapped in tissue paper and the icy chill of emotional closure. Some even went as far as publicly burning their former love's letters and gifts. Not out of rage, of course. Rage was too messy. But as a poetic gesture, because nothing says "I'm over you" like inviting a few close friends over to watch a symbolic bonfire of romantic regret while sipping lukewarm tea and pretending you're fine. Now, if the breakup was mutual and quietly handled, both parties could move on with dignity. But if the engagement had been public, or worse, printed, then breaking it off was a guaranteed scandal. Broken engagements were not seen as getting to know yourself. They were reputation crimes. Everyone assumed someone had done something terrible, flirted too much, flirted too little, or simply existed without full approval from 6 relatives and a vicar. For the woman, the fallout was often brutal. Her chances of marrying again could plummet, especially if people assumed she had been compromised in any way. One broken engagement could turn a debutante into a spinster in record time, unless she had serious family wealth or an uncle in Parliament. For the man, the stakes were less ruinous but still awkward. He might be labelled a cad or a fortune hunter, or worse, his tailor might start measuring him coldly, and everyone talked. Everyone. Gossip spread through church pews, ballrooms, and the occasional scandal column disguised as gardening advice. You'd become a cautionary tale. Don't go walking with Mr. Bellamy. He'll propose, then vanish like a gentleman-shaped fog. So while today's breakups involve texts, direct messages, or awkward coffee chats, the Victorians preferred ceremonial heartbreak, with letters penned in ink, returned gifts wrapped like emotional evidence, and reputations hanging in the balance. Every breakup was a performance. A painfully polite, emotionally repressed, and florally scented performance. And as the dust settled and the final letter was folded shut, all you could do was sit by the fire, clutch your returned hummingbird, and wait for society to forget. Which, of course, it never did. Ah, the Victorian wedding. A sacred rite, a public performance, and a subtle real estate negotiation, all wrapped in lace, lilies, and layers of emotional denial. After months or even years of eyebrow lifts, gloved flirtations, carefully curated flower meanings, and terrifying chats with your beloved's mother, you finally arrived at the finish line. Matrimony. Well done. Now comes the hard part. Smiling in a corset for 12 straight hours, while pretending you're not terrified. Let's break down the bizarre blend of love, duty, economy, and very awkward dancing that made up the Victorian wedding machine. Before Queen Victoria married Prince Albert in 1840, brides wore basically whatever: blues, golds, silvers, even black, especially if you were practical and already planning ahead for your funeral outfit. But Victoria showed up in a snow-white gown, lace sleeves, and zero chill. She wasn't just starting a marriage, she was starting a fashion revolution. Suddenly white became the color of choice, symbolizing purity, virginity, and the crushing anxiety of every bride who now had to compete with royal-level lacework. For wealthier families it became a flex. Look, we can afford a dress our daughter will never wear again. And this wasn't a run to the tailor last-minute affair. No, gowns were custom-made, embroidered, corseted, and stuffed with symbolic trimmings. Orange blossoms for fertility, myrtle for love, and just enough tulle to accidentally suffocate a flower girl. The wedding ceremony was often held in the morning, preferably before noon, as afternoon weddings were reserved for widows or scandal repair jobs. It took place in a church, featured strictly scripted vows, and had about as much spontaneity as a tax audit. The father would give away the bride, which was both symbolic and, in many cases, disturbingly accurate, especially if her dowry had already been negotiated down to the last teacup set. The groom stood stiffly, trying not to faint. The bride stood stiffer, trying not to fall over from corset-induced oxygen loss. And of course, everyone was watching. Everyone, including former suitors, gossiping aunts, and that one cousin who still thought you'd make a great match with someone else. Let's be honest, not all Victorian weddings were the thrilling culmination of a forbidden love story. Plenty were strategic alliances, where affection was optional and property lines were paramount. Families often arranged matches with one eye on family reputation and the other on livestock. The ideal match wasn't just about shared values. It was about shared economic interests, compatible inheritances, and making sure your children would have the correct nose shape to marry upward. A love match was seen as dangerously impulsive. What? You like each other? Sounds suspiciously modern. Still, the Victorian era did begin to romanticize marriage, thanks to the rise of the middle class and novels that whispered things like follow your heart, while conveniently skipping over bills and child-rearing. This shift gave hope to hopeful hearts, but also raised the bar for disillusionment. After the ceremony came the wedding breakfast, which was more like a multi-course feast held while everyone judged the floral arrangements and speculated about the honeymoon. Guests were served elaborate meals featuring jellied meats, ornamental cakes, and enough sherry to make Aunt Margaret think she was 20 again. There were toasts, so many toasts. Fathers toasted, vicars toasted, random army officers toasted, you toasted, your liver toasted. The bride and groom were expected to eat little, speak less, and smile like emotionally repressed statues, while dodging intrusive questions like, so when will we hear the patter of tiny feet? Honeymoons were a relatively new invention during this period, and often involved visiting family estates or touring picturesque ruins, while trying not to accidentally hold hands in public. Romantic, right? Sometimes, a chaperone joined for part of the journey, especially if the bride was young, or the family didn't fully trust the groom not to attempt premature handkerchief removal. And even when it was just the two of them, the honeymoon could be awkward. Victorian couples were frequently clueless about marital intimacy, having been educated by a mix of cryptic metaphors, stiff upper lips, and books that compared passion to wilting dahlias. So the honeymoon could involve anything from tender bonding to deeply confused staring. Also, don't expect snorkeling in the Bahamas. Most honeymoons involved train travel, sightseeing, and joint journaling, because nothing says passion like sketching a medieval cathedral next to your new spouse, while pretending not to be terrified of physical affection. Once married, the couple returned home to a new chapter, life as a legally and socially sanctioned pair of Victorian roommates. Public affection was frowned upon. Personal opinions were carefully rationed. If you were lucky, you liked each other. If not, you just powered through with social events, quiet dinners, and a growing collection of porcelain. Women lost most of their legal independence upon marriage. Coverture laws ensured that her property, her earnings, and even her legal identity were absorbed into her husband's. In exchange, she got the joys of managing a household, dressing like a curtain, and being called my dear in an emotionally neutral tone for the next 40 years. So yes, congratulations on making it to the altar. You've survived etiquette, mothers-in-law, flower symbolism, and scandal. Now, buckle in for a lifetime of monogrammed linens, occasional ball invitations, and softly murmured conversations about gooseberry jam. Because in the Victorian era, marriage wasn't the end of courtship. It was just the start of an elaborate, corseted duet of polite endurance. Congratulations. You've done it. You've endured lace chafing, curtsies, coded fan language, dowry negotiations, and 5 fainting spells to arrive at the holy institution of Victorian marriage. The invitations are mailed. The cake is stale. The confetti is biodegradable, mostly flower petals and crushed hopes. Now comes the part no one included in the poetry: married life. If courtship was a carefully choreographed waltz of longing, then marriage was often the emotional equivalent of filing joint taxes for eternity. That's not to say love died, just that it went into hiding somewhere behind the grandfather clock. Next to your unopened wedding gift from Cousin Edgar, romance in marriage, if it still existed, was now expected to be tasteful, reserved, and deeply filtered through Victorian social code. Gone were the moonlit letters soaked in longing. In their place, subtle glances over teacups and the occasional pat on the hand if no one was watching. The newlywed phase, in theory, was meant to be blissful, but real life quickly barged in with bills, servants to supervise, and furniture to dust obsessively. Conversations shifted from, "I burn for you," to "the hedge needs trimming, and your sister's visiting again." Victorian society loved the concept of separate spheres. Men belonged in the public world, politics, commerce, walking around with important hats. Women, they were rulers of the domestic realm, aka the house, the children, the moral compass, and the emotional labor. In short, he went out, she stayed home, he managed estate business or bank accounts, she managed 10 courses of dinner without crying. This division wasn't just cultural, it was moral. The ideal woman was pure, nurturing, and ethereal. The ideal man was decisive, stoic, and mildly allergic to feelings. Together, they were supposed to form a perfect complementary pair. In practice, this often meant polite detachment and deep emotional misunderstandings, especially if either party tried to color outside their assigned lines. A wife who showed too much independence was unfeminine. A husband who helped with the baby, possibly French. Now let's talk about the part below the frilly surface. Extramarital affairs. Yes, they happened. And frequently, but unlike the flamboyant scandals of French salons, Victorian affairs were a delicate dance of secrecy and plausible deniability. Upper-class men had mistresses. It was practically a cliché. As long as you didn't flaunt it in public or bring her to the opera in your wife's seat, society often looked the other way. Women were held to a stricter standard, of course. A woman caught in adultery faced ruin, exile, and an entire subplot in a tragic novel. But that didn't mean they didn't engage in emotional or sometimes physical affairs. Letters were burned, eyes were avoided, and neighbors speculated like their life depended on it. Marriage became a kind of Victorian customer service interaction, courteous, distant, and full of formal titles. You didn't call your spouse honey or babe. You used my dear, my love, or when things got spicy, Mrs. Caraway. Affection was mostly private, and even then, restrained. Public displays of affection were frowned upon. Even sitting too close could raise eyebrows. Children were told their parents loved each other very much, which was mostly demonstrated through seasonal gift-giving and sitting quietly on opposite sides of the drawing room. This wasn't just repression, it was expectation. Passion belonged in poetry and Greek myths, not in respectable parlors. One of the clearest expectations of marriage was procreation. Children were blessings, burdens, heirs, and occasionally chess pieces in the game of legacy and social positioning. Once kids arrived, romance was lucky to get a foot in the door. Women were expected to become full-time mothers, if not biologically, then through managing nannies and governesses. Men, meanwhile, shook their children's hands once a week and asked about Latin. Parental intimacy took a backseat to nursery routines, measles outbreaks, and the daily task of not dying from some ghastly airborne miasma. Victorian couples were in it for the long haul. Divorce was rare and scandalous, even when the marriage resembled two armchairs pointed politely away from each other. A woman who wanted out had to prove abuse or adultery, and even then, she might lose everything. A man had more legal options, but would face social backlash if he looked too eager. So most couples simply stayed together. Some were happy, some were tolerable, and others perfected the art of the emotionally frostbitten breakfast conversation. Many middle and upper-class couples had separate bedrooms, especially later in life, which was viewed as dignified rather than distant. Your love might have begun in flowery metaphors, but now it lived in polite nods, inherited tea sets, and the occasional shared opinion on the neighbor's hedge. So yes, you married for love, maybe, or money, or family pressure. Regardless, now you're deep into the domestic symphony of routine, repression, and romantic ideals neatly tucked away in your sock drawer. The Victorian marriage wasn't necessarily cold. It was just efficient, ornamental, and occasionally haunted by repressed longing and faint piano music. If courtship was the fireworks, marriage was the embers, still warm, still glowing, just not allowed to leave scorch marks on the parlor carpet. The accidental birth of the Eiffel Tower, France's giant metal middle finger. Imagine being France in the late 1800s. You've just been thoroughly smacked around in the Franco-Prussian War. Your mustaches are drooping with national shame, and you've been watching your rival Germany flex with terrifying efficiency and better beer. It's a low point. So what do you do when you're a proud country trying to rebound from a humiliating defeat? You throw a massive party, and not just any party. France decided to host the Exposition Universelle of 1889, a giant international World's Fair, to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution, because nothing screams we're still relevant, like inviting the entire world to come stare at your stuff while you desperately act like everything is fine. But Paris needed something more than just cheese, impressionist paintings, and smug existentialism. It needed a showstopper, a crown jewel, a structure so outrageous and modern that it would practically slap the rest of Europe in the face and say, "Still got it, baby." The French government opened up a design competition to all engineers, architects, and probably some overly confident baristas with blueprints sketched on napkins. The goal? To build something tall, bold, and utterly unforgettable on the Champs de Mars, that big green space near the Seine that used to host military drills, riots, and the occasional poorly attended picnic. The entries came flooding in, over 100 in total. Among the more creative options, a 300-meter guillotine. Yes, you read that right. One group thought a great way to commemorate the French Revolution was to build a massive beheading-themed death monument. Nothing says welcome to Paris like a skyline dominated by a reminder of decapitation. Another contender suggested a giant water tower shaped like a lighthouse. And someone else even wanted to build a gigantic steam-powered elephant that people could walk inside of. This was either architectural innovation or the result of someone drinking too much absinthe and submitting fan fiction from a Jules Verne fever dream. Then came a relatively modest design from a man named Maurice Coquelin and Émile Nouguier, two engineers working for the company of Gustave Eiffel, a guy best known at the time for building bridges and having excellent facial hair. Their concept? A giant iron lattice tower, essentially a vertical web of metal beams that looked less like a building and more like something a spider might construct if it had access to rivets. Eiffel wasn't initially sold. It looked weird. It didn't scream art or revolution or even structurally sane. But after a few redesigns, some added arches at the base for flair, and let's be honest, to make it less terrifying, and Eiffel realizing he could slap his name on it forever, the idea started to grow on him. He purchased the design outright, presented it with the confidence of a man selling fire to cavemen, and somehow got the green light. The Eiffel Tower was chosen as the official centerpiece of the 1889 World's Fair. At the time, it would be the tallest man-made structure on Earth, clocking in at just over 300 meters, 984 feet. That was more than twice the height of the Great Pyramid of Giza. And unlike the pyramids, it wasn't full of mummies. It was full of cold, unromantic, industrial-age metal. Very French. Now you might assume the public reacted with roaring applause and baguette-throwing celebrations, but no. The reactions ranged from mild confusion to full-on existential despair. One Parisian woman was quoted saying, "It looks like a factory chimney mated with a skeleton." Newspapers published cartoons portraying the tower as a giant pitchfork stabbing the sky. Critics called it a tragedy in iron, a soulless monster, and something that should only exist if you're trying to signal aliens. And let's not forget the artists. Paris in the 1880s was crawling with poets, painters, and other tortured souls who believed beauty belonged in brushstrokes, not bolts. They were outraged. Not just annoyed, philosophically offended. They signed petitions, raged in salons, and refused to dine anywhere the tower could be seen. France wanted a showstopper. Some wanted a guillotine. Eiffel gave them an antenna. Tomato. But despite the outrage, confusion, and general Parisian groaning, the plan moved forward. Why? Because Eiffel had something most critics didn't: contracts, and money, and political backing, and the sheer force of will to erect something that would make the rest of Europe look like it was still living in the 18th century. The stage was set. Paris would get its tower. People would hate it. Tourists would gawk. Artists would sulk. And the world would soon be introduced to what would become one of the most iconic mistakes-turned-masterpieces in architectural history. But first, it had to be built, before his name became permanently bolted to 10,000 tons of iron. Gustave Eiffel was not a household name, unless your household was full of steel beams and blueprints. In fact, Eiffel was the kind of man who probably described a sunset in terms of atmospheric pressure. He wasn't born with grandeur in mind. He was born in Dijon in 1832. Yes, the mustard place. To a family of modest means who were more into business than bridges. He studied chemical engineering, of all things, and only stumbled into structural engineering after graduation like someone who opened the wrong door at a career fair and just decided to roll with it. But what Eiffel lacked in early direction, he more than made up for with precision, calculation, and sheer nerd energy. By the time he hit his stride, he wasn't just building bridges, he was redefining them. In the late 1800s, Eiffel was already respected in engineering circles for doing things no one else wanted to try, like designing wrought iron railway bridges that spanned impossible distances and somehow didn't collapse. This might sound normal to you now, but back then, people still thought trains might explode if they went too fast, and that iron had feelings. One of his biggest hits before the tower was the Garabit Viaduct, a gorgeous red monster of a bridge arcing over a gorge in southern France. At the time, it was one of the highest bridges in the world. You know you've made it when your bridge gives people nosebleeds. But here's the twist. Most tourists don't know. Eiffel didn't even design the Eiffel Tower. The original concept was cooked up by two of his employees, Maurice Coquelin and Amélie Noguier, who pitched it as a 300-meter tower with a wide base and open latticework to reduce wind resistance. Translation: tall, weird, and way too ambitious. Eiffel's first reaction was lukewarm. He reportedly looked at the sketch, blinked a few times, and mentally filed it under neat. But let's not. But then his in-house architect, Stephen Sauvestre, dressed it up with decorative arches and a fancy glass pavilion on top, and suddenly, Eiffel saw dollar signs, or at least franc signs. He bought the rights to the design outright, slapped his name on it like a kid, claiming credit for a group project, and started marketing it like a 19th century Steve Jobs. Because while Eiffel was a brilliant engineer, what made him dangerous was his ability to sell ideas, and not just any ideas, terrifyingly impractical, eye-wateringly expensive ideas. Eiffel could walk into a room full of skeptical bureaucrats with a blueprint for a 1,000-foot-tall iron Q-tip and leave with funding and applause. He didn't just present ideas, he wrapped them in science, statistics, patriotism, and pure charisma. He pitched the tower as a beacon of French innovation, a symbol of industrial strength, a marvel of wind resistance and load distribution. And when that didn't work, he threw in the idea that it could be used for scientific experiments. Meteorology, astronomy, long-range communication. Basically, it's not just a tower, it's a science lab with stairs. Eiffel didn't just build bridges, he burned them behind him while running toward world records. Of course, Eiffel had another ace up his sleeve. Timing. France was still nursing its ego after losing Alsace-Lorraine to Prussia, and nothing heals a national wound like the promise of having the tallest thing on earth. Eiffel understood this. He didn't just build structures, he built narratives. Let's show the world France is still on top, he told officials, while quietly doodling wind tunnel experiments on the margins of his pitch notes. Once the project was greenlit, Eiffel took full ownership, financially and personally. He struck a deal where he would finance the majority of construction himself, in exchange for a 20-year lease on the tower after the fair. That's right. He rented the skyline of Paris. Amazon wishes it had that kind of power. And when critics started foaming at the mouth about the iron nightmare infecting their beloved skyline, Eiffel didn't flinch. Instead, he published essays defending the tower's aesthetic and engineering merits. He invited journalists to the construction site to see the precision of the work. He even made public speeches like a candidate running for mayor of geometry. But here's the wildest part. Eiffel genuinely believed in it. He wasn't bluffing. He saw the future in rivets and girders, where others saw a mechanical monstrosity. He saw a platform to launch France into the modern age, a lightning rod for science, industry, and artistic evolution. Spoiler alert, he was right. By the time the foundation was being dug, Eiffel had already ensured that history would remember the tower as his. And while he wasn't the original designer, he was absolutely the reason it got built, defended, and preserved. The man could sell an ice cube to a penguin, as long as the cube was structurally sound and had excellent wind resistance. Let's set the stage. It's January 1887, and Paris is minding its own elegant, wine-soaked business, when something unholy begins to sprout in the Champ de Mars. Not a new garden, not a new opera house. No, a tower, a giant, riveted, unapologetically iron monstrosity. The Eiffel Tower wasn't built like the monuments before it. Those were lovingly carved from stone, whispered about by philosophers, and funded by kings. No, the Eiffel Tower was a full-on industrial assault. It was born with blueprints, bolts, and bad PR. The assembly begins, screwing together a colossus construction started on January 28, 1887, and the numbers alone are enough to make your modern office cubicle tremble. The beast would eventually be made from 18,038 individual iron parts and held together by 2.5 million rivets, each one hammered in by hand. If that sounds exhausting, it's because it was. They didn't have hydraulic lifts or cherry pickers. They had scaffolding, cranks, and nerves of steel, mostly because they worked with steel all day. About 300 workers toiled on site, not an army, but more like a very stressed-out sports team, building the stadium while playing in it. These weren't just average day labourers either. Eiffel hand-picked some of the best ironworkers in France, men who could scale beams like squirrels and make gravity cry uncle. What they were doing had never been attempted at this scale before. Each prefabricated iron piece, measured down to the last bolt back at the factory in Levallois-Perret, had to fit exactly into place. One miscalculation, and you wouldn't just get a crooked tower, you'd get a 1,000-foot death trap. The first hurdle, the legs. They had to be inclined at a precise angle and anchored perfectly into 4 massive stone foundations. Imagine trying to build a 4-legged stool that's almost 1,000 feet tall on uneven ground, while people throw baguettes at you from a distance. Safety. Surprisingly not a bloodbath. Now let's talk about safety, which in 1887 was usually spelled shrug, but Eiffel, for all his drama and flair, was obsessed with worker welfare. He designed mobile scaffolding, guardrails, and even safety screens, practically unheard of at the time. And the results? Only one recorded death during construction. Just one. That's astonishing, when you consider that in 1880s France, people could die just from looking at a baguette wrong. But Eiffel's meticulous planning and factory-produced components meant fewer mistakes and much lower risk. In a century that invented the guillotine and syphilis, this level of care was practically revolutionary. Meanwhile in Paris, mass panic. As the tower began to rise, it wasn't just iron bolts being tested. It was the collective patience of Parisian high society. To say the city was unimpressed is an understatement. People weren't just skeptical, they were outraged. Writers, painters, critics, and the extremely well-mustached elite signed angry petitions, calling it a metallic carcass and tragically industrial. They feared it would cast a literal and metaphorical shadow over Paris. One especially poetic critic claimed it would turn the city into a black smudge on a painter's canvas. Another lamented that the tower looked like a skeleton of a factory chimney married to a street lamp. The city had survived revolutions and invasions, but nothing prepared them for 300 meters of iron, slowly clawing its way into the sky. Imagine your peaceful neighborhood suddenly sprouts a massive iron bug. That's how Paris felt. Some residents moved away just so they wouldn't have to see it. Others stayed and stared, horrified, as the structure grew floor by floor like a metal fungus. Horses reportedly spooked at the sight of it. One cafe owner claimed it was scaring away customers. And yet, Eiffel, bless his steel-plated heart, kept building, engineering brilliance in the face of outrage. While Parisians dry-heaved into their wine glasses, Eiffel's crew pushed forward with scientific zeal. Each stage of the tower had to be precisely measured and balanced, especially as they started connecting the diagonal legs to form the base's first platform. The math had to be perfect. The tools weren't digital, no lasers, no software, just rulers, plumb bobs, and caffeine-fueled calculations. Even the wind had to be accounted for. The structure was so open, all that lattice work, and no solid walls, because it needed to bend with the wind, not fight it. Gustave Eiffel knew, if the wind wanted to tango, the tower had to lead and follow. That flexibility is one reason it's still standing today. From mockery to momentum, by 1888, the public sentiment began to shift. Slowly, The tower's silhouette was still offending everyone with a paintbrush, but people were starting to appreciate the audacity. It had climbed higher than any human structure ever had. It was a middle finger to architectural tradition, but also a marvel. Construction continued at a breakneck pace. By the end of 1888, the second platform was complete. The tower was 2/3 done, already dwarfing every other structure in Paris, and making the critics look less like guardians of taste and more like toddlers, upset about a bedtime they didn't set. The metal bug had legs. Soon, it would have antennas. By the time the Eiffel Tower started poking into the Parisian skyline, like an iron needle through the silk of a Monet painting, the city's artists were already reaching for their pitchforks, metaphorically of course. You can't stab a 300-meter tower with oil pastels, but by the fury of Paris's bohemian elite, they were going to try anyway. What unfolded over the next few years was not just an artistic critique, it was a cultural meltdown. The Eiffel Tower wasn't just unpopular among Paris's intellectual class, it was a full-blown existential threat to the city's self-image. The world's tallest structure wasn't rising in some gritty industrial port or windswept American prairie. No, it was climbing inch by inch into the middle of the most refined, exquisitely designed city in Europe, a place where symmetry and style were treated with near-religious reverence. In Paris, buildings had rules, facades had manners, streets flowed with the grace of a ballet, and then, suddenly, from the manicured lawns of the Champ de Mars, came a thing that looked like a giant metal toothpick that had just escaped a junkyard. The backlash from the art world was not subtle. It came fast, loud, and in many syllables. Critics, poets, painters, composers, sculptors, architects, journalists, and possibly even some angry mime troops joined together to publicly denounce the tower. It was ugly, it was barbaric, it was an insult to Paris, and above all, it was modern, which, in late 19th century art circles, was practically a slur. So they did what angry French intellectuals do best. They wrote a petition, and not just any petition. It was published in 1887, and addressed to none other than the man overseeing the Exposition Universelle himself. The open letter called the tower a monstrous black smokestack and an odious column of sheet metal bolts. It was signed by some of the most prominent cultural figures of the day, including Charles Gounod, composer, Alexandre Dumas-Fils, writer, Guy de Maupassant, the moody novelist we'll be talking more about in a second, and a gaggle of other very important people with very fragile aesthetic sensibilities. This wasn't just snobbery, it was fear. The Eiffel Tower represented an invasion of modernity, an unrelenting industrial skeleton, gate-crashing a garden party of Rococo sensibilities. Until then, art in Paris had rules and traditions. Buildings whispered elegance. The Eiffel Tower shouted math. It wasn't carved, it was calculated. It didn't rise with grace, it was riveted into place. It was everything artists feared the future might be. Cold, mechanical, utilitarian, and worst of all, popular. Then there was Guy de Maupassant, who reportedly hated the tower so much that he developed a strategy worthy of a passive-aggressive genius. He started eating lunch underneath it. Why? Because it was the only place in Paris where he didn't have to see the thing. That's right. He willingly endured tourist crowds, clanging metal, and the occasional pigeon ambush, all so he could mentally erase the Eiffel Tower from his skyline. Parisian artists hated it so much, they used their lunch breaks to pretend it didn't exist. That's dedication. But even as the ink dried on angry essays and petitions fluttered across literary salons, something strange began to happen. A few brave souls started changing their minds, not because they liked the tower. No, that would have been too simple. They simply realized the Eiffel Tower wasn't going anywhere. And worse, people seemed to like it. Tourists were already gawking. Engineers were already applauding. And once it opened in 1889, regular Parisians, much to the horror of their monocled tastemakers, started going up to enjoy the views. This wasn't just an artistic crisis, it was a credibility problem. If you're a painter who spent 3 years bad-mouthing a tower, and suddenly your wealthy patrons want to picnic beneath it, or commission paintings of it, you have two choices: cling to your principles or quietly sell out. Guess which one they picked? Sure enough, the same people who once decried the Eiffel Tower as a metallic parasite slowly began to include it in their paintings. Postcards featuring the tower flew off the shelves. Sometime between all the yelling and the deep sighing, the Eiffel Tower stopped being a threat and started being iconic. It was still considered ugly by many, but it was our ugly, a national oddity too stubborn to die and too tall to ignore. In a way, the Eiffel Tower did what all great art does. It forced people to confront their assumptions. It wasn't beautiful by traditional standards, but it had a strange, industrial grace. It didn't speak the language of stone and shadow, but it hummed with steel and symmetry. It was engineering turned sculpture, science disguised as skyline. And as time marched forward, the artists, many of them begrudgingly, realized the tower wasn't the end of art in Paris. It was the start of something new. Now that the tower had elbowed its way into the cultural conversation and stolen all the attention and lunch views, the next challenge was making sure it stuck around. Because believe it or not, this metal giant still had an expiration date. When the Eiffel Tower first planted its iron feet into the soil of the Champ de Mars, it did so with an ominous ticking clock above its head. Unlike the pyramids or Notre Dame, this was not built to be eternal. In fact, it had a lease. Literally, the city of Paris had agreed to let the Eiffel Tower stand for 20 years. After that, down it goes. Scrapped, dismantled, sold for parts, turned into an unsettling number of kettles, maybe. This was a showpiece, a spotlight hog, a metallic mayfly designed to wow crowds at the 1889 Exposition Universelle, and then vanish, leaving only postcards and back pain from climbing it. Gustave Eiffel, however, was not about to let his legacy become a glorified coat rack. While Paris politely made demolition plans in the background, because politeness is still mandatory when you're contemplating structural murder, Eiffel was busy rewriting the tower's job description. If the city wanted to take down the world's tallest man-made object, he'd need to give it a reason to stay standing, and Eiffel, being the eternal engineer/hype man, found his savior in the one thing Parisians couldn't argue with: science. That's right. He didn't save the Eiffel Tower with sentiment. He saved it with thermometers and Morse code. From the moment construction ended, Eiffel was renting out his 300-meter lightning rod to the nerdiest corners of academia. Meteorology was the first tenant. Eiffel, with the enthusiasm of a man who probably brought barometers to dinner parties, set up a weather lab at the top. Why climb a mountain for air pressure readings when you had a metal one in your backyard? Then came aerodynamics. Eiffel started dropping objects from the tower. Yes, seriously, measuring how things fell in air. If you're wondering how the man who built a tower taller than any before it spent his time after, the answer is dropping balls off it in the name of lift and drag. This research would later feed directly into the development of aircraft design, meaning, in a strange way, the Eiffel Tower helped humanity get off the ground, literally. But Eiffel wasn't done. He had one last trick up his iron sleeve. By the early 1900s, the world was getting wired and unwired. The spark of radio technology was catching fire. Across the globe, inventors were sending messages through the air, a mystical feat that made telegraph wires look like rotary phones wearing powdered wigs. Eiffel saw the potential immediately. His tower, tall and made of metal, wasn't just a landmark, it was the perfect antenna. So in 1903, engineers began conducting wireless transmission experiments from the top of the Eiffel Tower. Eiffel himself allowed the French military to install transmission equipment on the platform. Messages were sent from Paris to receivers miles away. The results: instant communication across vast distances. France had just discovered the group chat, and it was powered by 18,038 iron parts and one very smug engineer. By 1906, the Eiffel Tower was sending out official military messages. It had morphed from an artistic eyesore to a national asset. You couldn't tear it down now. It was strategically important. Taking it down would be like selling your Wi-Fi router for scrap metal. Even the French military, never known for gushing sentiment, conceded that this iron stick might just be worth keeping around after all. This sudden transformation from eyesore to irreplaceable was frankly poetic. The very tower once mocked as a metal asparagus had become the nerve center of French communication. Scientists were lining up to test theories at its summit. Meteorologists were measuring cloud movement. Soldiers were decoding blips and beeps. The Eiffel Tower had gone from Paris's most hated structure to the smartest guy in the room. Eiffel himself used this shift as a full-on redemption arc. The man who once fought off artistic mobs now stood triumphant, having turned his mechanical Frankenstein into a national treasure. He even built a small office at the top of the tower, complete with a desk, some furniture, and allegedly wax figures of Thomas Edison and other science buddies. This was Eiffel's way of saying, "I told you so," in the most passive-aggressively nerdy way possible. The public, meanwhile, slowly came around, not because they fell in love with the tower's design that took decades, but because it had become useful. Function won hearts where form had failed. If something makes your military faster, your weather forecasts better, and your scientists excited, you tend to tolerate it, even if it still looks like a colossal egg whisk. In a twist of fate, the thing that was supposed to be torn down in 1909 never left. The lease expired, but the purpose remained. Eiffel's iron monstrosity had worked its way into the machinery of France. You couldn't just take it apart now. It was a national antenna, and in the age of wireless communication, that was as good as a crown jewel. By the time the 20th century got into full swing, the Eiffel Tower had already gone through its awkward adolescence, loathed, mocked, then quietly tolerated, because it happened to be incredibly useful. But even usefulness doesn't protect you from bad taste or budget cuts. Despite becoming the tallest member of France's science club and doing an outstanding impression of a 1,000-foot antenna, the Eiffel Tower found itself repeatedly balancing on the edge of demolition. In fact, if the tower had a diary, most of its entries from 1909 to 1945 would read something like, "Survived another attempt on my life today. Parisians still unconvinced. I'm cute. Send help." Let's start with the basic problem. Nobody could decide what to do with it. The original 20-year permit expired in 1909. According to the contract, that's when the land was supposed to revert back to the city, and the giant iron skeleton was to be torn down piece by piece, like a very tall Lego set no one wanted anymore. Even Gustave Eiffel couldn't stall forever. But by then, as we explored in the previous chapter, the tower had wormed its way into usefulness. Science, military communications, weather experiments, dropping heavy stuff from great heights, very advanced science. That one. So the city begrudgingly gave it a stay of execution. But it was always a conditional stay. Keep proving your worth, or it's the scrapyard for you. That sword of Damocles dangled dangerously close, again and again. Even as late as the 1920s and 30s, there were multiple formal proposals to take the Eiffel Tower down. Some plans were practical. Maintaining the Iron Beast was expensive. You don't just Windex 18,000 parts, you inspect them, replace rusted bolts, paint the entire thing, which takes years and hundreds of gallons of specialized paint, and then start over again before pigeons declare it a sovereign nation. And unlike beloved cathedrals or charming old buildings, the tower had no ancient history to romanticize. It was just there, big, loud, and in some opinions, deeply unattractive. Which brings us to the ongoing aesthetic war. Architects, designers, and city planners repeatedly lobbied to flatten the thing. It didn't fit with Paris's skyline, they said. It clashed with the elegance of Haussmann's boulevards, they wailed. You couldn't look at the Seine without it photobombing the horizon, they moaned. For some Parisians, the tower was the ultimate party guest who refused to leave and kept sitting on the good furniture. But perhaps the tower's darkest chapter came not from city councils or budget meetings, but from war. When World War I broke out in 1914, any dreams of tearing down the Eiffel Tower were immediately shelved. The French army had more pressing concerns, such as not being overrun by Germany, and once again, the tower's usefulness saved it. It became a key communications node, transmitting military messages via radio, a crucial edge in wartime strategy. In a world without satellites or fiber optics, having a 1,000-foot antenna was a tactical blessing. Eiffel's monument wasn't just a landmark, it was part of the war effort. Fast forward a couple of decades to 1940. Enter Hitler. You know, the guy who walked into countries uninvited and redecorated them with swastikas. When the Nazis occupied Paris during World War II, they made a dramatic entrance, strolling through the Arc de Triomphe like it was their Airbnb. Hitler, ever the fan of theatrical gestures, reportedly wanted the Eiffel Tower demolished. After all, if he couldn't plant his flag on top of it without getting windburned, why let it remain? But here's where the French pulled off one of history's most passive-aggressive acts of resistance. A mysterious incident occurred. The lift cables on the Eiffel Tower were cut. Whether it was an accident or a highly convenient case of sabotage remains a deliciously murky detail. What we do know is this: with the elevators out of commission, any visiting Nazis who wanted to climb to the top to hoist a flag or take a triumphant selfie had to hoof it up 1,665 stairs. Strangely, Hitler never made the climb. The tower stood tall through the occupation, refusing to bow or kneel. While Paris fell under enemy control, the Eiffel Tower became a silent symbol of French defiance. It was the country's middle finger made of iron, and unlike its citizens, it couldn't be arrested or sent to a labor camp. As the war raged on, the tower remained untouched. Air raids bombed nearby buildings. Fires lit up the city, but the Eiffel Tower, not even a scratch. It was as if the universe knew that removing it now would be one insult too many. By the time Paris was liberated in 1944, the Eiffel Tower had survived art critics, city planners, 2 world wars, and a dictator with demolition fantasies. What was supposed to be a temporary showpiece had proven it could outlast revolutions and redesigns. It had become part of Paris, not through unanimous love, but through pure, gritty survival. The Iron Colossus had endured threats both bureaucratic and ballistic, not to mention decades of being called ugly in at least 6 languages, yet it stood, unapologetic, unpainted in spots, and still defying gravity and public opinion. By the end of World War II, the idea of tearing it down seemed not only impractical, but treasonous. It wasn't just part of the skyline anymore, it was the skyline. At some point between being the monstrous black smokestack of shame and the place where tourists now propose with shaky hands and expensive rings, the Eiffel Tower pulled off the architectural equivalent of a high school revenge glow-up. You know the type: mocked, misunderstood, probably ate lunch alone, only to show up later looking stunning, successful, and suddenly everyone's favorite backdrop for an Instagram story. In the case of the Eiffel Tower, this transformation was no accident. It was a slow, clunky, bolt-by-bolt redemption arc that took decades. But by the 1920s and 1930s, public opinion began to tilt, and once it started, it snowballed. The tower didn't just become accepted, it became beloved, the heart, soul, and symmetrical selfie center of Paris. Let's rewind to the 1920s. France, like the rest of the world, was doing its best impression of post-war euphoria. The horrors of World War I were over for now, and the 1920s ushered in jazz flappers and the cultural frenzy of les années folles, the crazy years. Paris was once again a magnet for artists, thinkers, and anyone who could pull off a beret unironically. And the Eiffel Tower, it was still standing. That was victory enough. But something funny started happening. The very artists who once declared it an iron disgrace began to warm up to it, slowly, awkwardly, like someone realizing their arch-nemesis is kind of hot in the right lighting. Photographers began framing the tower in moody black and white portraits. Painters stopped caricaturing it as a mechanical beast and started experimenting with angles, colors, and romantic silhouettes. Even Art Deco embraced its bold geometry. The tower was no longer the villain of the skyline, it was the muse. Meanwhile, commercial businesses noticed something else. This thing draws a crowd, and nothing Paris loves more than a crowd willing to buy coffee and postcards. So the tower began its literal glow-up with lighting displays, an innovation that made it look less like a dark iron skeleton and more like a beacon of modernity. These illuminations started as functional safety measures, but quickly evolved into less spectacle. By the 1930s, it twinkled, it shimmered, it shined. Paris wasn't just the city of light, it was now the city with that light. Restaurants up in the tower were renovated and upgraded. Dining there went from being a strange novelty to a bucket list event. Imagine eating roasted duck 200 meters above the ground while Paris glimmers beneath you. Hard to hate something that hands you wine with a view like that. The tower also leaned into its cultural capital. It became a movie star. Directors loved it. Film reels showed it as everything from a romantic perch to a spy drop zone. It was featured on book covers, travel posters, and increasingly, in logos. French companies started slapping silhouettes of the Eiffel Tower onto products like it was a stamp of national authenticity. Toothpaste? Put the tower on it. Chocolates? Definitely. Soap? Why not? The Eiffel Tower could sell anything, even itself. This commercial embrace didn't go unnoticed by the public. People began associating the tower with French elegance, sophistication, and ironically, timelessness. The very thing once ridiculed as a passing fad now represented permanence. When someone wanted to signal, "Ah yes, this is French," they didn't show baguettes, they showed the tower. It helped that during this time, Paris was competing on the world stage for cultural dominance. The British had Big Ben. The Americans were stacking up skyscrapers like Jenga towers. The Eiffel Tower became France's way of saying, "We were bold before it was cool." It was their architectural flex, still taller than most things, still standing, and finally admired. By the time World War II ended, the Eiffel Tower wasn't just a landmark, it was a survivor. Having endured occupation, sabotage, and a dictator's demolition fantasy, the French viewed it with fresh eyes. There was pride in its resilience. Tourists who had only seen grainy photos now flocked to see it in person, and locals, they began to accept that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't a mistake after all. By the 1950s and 60s, postcards of the Eiffel Tower were outselling every other Parisian image, and something happened that would have made the original haters clutch their quills in horror. It became romantic. Couples kissed beneath it. Marriage proposals happened on its platforms. It became the Eiffel equivalent of a Lovelock bridge, long before that was trendy. And what about Guy de Maupassant, who allegedly dined under it to avoid seeing it? His name is now on one of the tower's restaurants. Ironic, deliciously so. The Eiffel Tower not only outlasted its critics, it absorbed them into its legend, like some kind of smug iron Pokemon. In just a few decades, it had completed a full cultural 180, from rust-colored monstrosity to glittering symbol of love, art, and French ingenuity. It didn't change. We did. The Eiffel Tower is many things: an architectural marvel, a national symbol, a romantic backdrop, and as it turns out, a magnet for stunts, scams, and sheer human absurdity. Once the dust settled from the tower's controversial birth and rocky adolescence, the world collectively looked at the 300-meter iron colossus and said, "How can I do something completely insane with that?" Turns out, the answer was a lot. Let's begin with one of the most gloriously bizarre moments in the tower's history, the time it was sold, not by the government, not as a metaphor, but by a con man. Twice. Enter Victor Lustig, an Austrian-born scammer, so smooth he could probably sell ice to penguins and convince them it was a limited edition. In 1925, Lustig noticed that the Eiffel Tower was in need of repairs and that Parisians were grumbling about its maintenance costs. This sparked a diabolical light bulb moment. He forged official government documents, posed as a bureaucrat, and summoned a group of scrap metal dealers to a fancy hotel. With the gravitas of a real estate agent selling waterfront property on the moon, Lustig claimed the French government had secretly decided to dismantle the Eiffel Tower and sell it for parts, but wanted to keep it hush-hush to avoid public outcry. One dealer, eager to beat the competition, forked over a briefcase full of francs and sealed the deal. Lustig vanished before anyone figured out that the Eiffel Tower was very much not for sale, and just when you think the story couldn't get better, he did it again. Same con, new victim. It's the architectural equivalent of selling someone the moon, then upselling them a lunar garage. Lustig wasn't the only one using the tower for personal theatrics. Daredevils couldn't resist it either. Early on, people looked at its height not as a warning, but a challenge. In 1912, a tailor named Franz Reichel decided the tower was the perfect place to test his homemade parachute suit, essentially a wearable tent. He told officials he'd be testing it with a dummy. Surprise! The dummy was him. He climbed to the first platform, posed for cameras, and promptly plummeted like an iron pigeon. The press dubbed him the Flying Tailor. He did not fly, or tailor, anything else, after that. And then came the tightrope walkers. In 1989, as part of the centennial celebration, French acrobat Philippe Petit, best known for illegally walking between the Twin Towers in New York, strutted his way across a cable strung between the Eiffel Tower and the Palais de Chaillot. Why? Because for some people, walking beside the tower isn't nearly dramatic enough. Let's not forget the cars. That's right, cars. In a 1926 stunt that screams, "What do you mean structural integrity?" The Citroën hoisted one of their vehicles up the tower to demonstrate the power of their engine, or maybe their complete lack of concern for physics. Citroën loved the tower so much they actually lit it up with their brand name in giant illuminated letters, essentially turning the Eiffel Tower into the world's tallest billboard. It stayed that way for over a decade. Eiffel might have turned in his grave. But hey, advertising space is advertising space. Over the years, the tower also became the site for high-stakes proposals, themed weddings, fine dining experiences that cost more than a month's rent, and the occasional naked protest. Yes, the Eiffel Tower has seen a surprising number of streakers. There's something about standing on a globally recognized monument that makes people want to declare their beliefs, or just their butts, to the world. And speaking of declarations, protesters have used the tower as their stage countless times, from Greenpeace activists to climate campaigners to political dissidents. Hanging banners off the tower's railings is practically a rite of passage for any protest group, with a harness and a cause. Nothing screams, "Listen to our demands," like dangling a giant piece of fabric off a 1,000-foot metal skeleton. Meanwhile, tourists and thrill seekers continue pushing the boundaries. There have been base jumpers, urban climbers, and parkour enthusiasts trying to scale the tower without permission. One man even tried to parachute off the top, but he didn't make it to the jump. Security caught him halfway up, and the whole event ended with less of a bang and more of a very expensive fine. And of course, the Eiffel Tower has a full history of fictional hijinks too. It's been kidnapped by aliens, shrunk by cartoon villains, and blown up in more disaster movies than any other European landmark. If movie logic is to be believed, the Eiffel Tower is the first thing to go when anything goes wrong. Earthquake, tower's gone. Giant lizard attack, bye-bye. Beacon. Sentient meteor made of cheese? Say no more. The tower is toast. So what is it about the Eiffel Tower that inspires all this madness? It's not just its height or fame, it's the sheer audacity of its existence. This gangly iron alien that defied expectations, outlived its expiration date, and now just dares you to ignore it. The tower stands like an invitation. Come climb me, dine on me, leap off me, or, if you're feeling particularly bold, try to sell me. For an iron skeleton that was nearly scrapped more times than a cheap toaster, the Eiffel Tower sure found a way to stay relevant by moonlighting as a spy tool, surviving world wars, and becoming the most recognizable silhouette on Earth, outside of Mickey Mouse's ears. The Eiffel Tower didn't just sit there looking pretty, it got involved. From wartime espionage to pop culture fame, all while acting like the tallest unpaid actor in film history. Let's start with World War I, because nothing says romantic landmark like covert military intelligence. While Parisians were ducking artillery shells and grappling with the chaos of a world at war, the Eiffel Tower quietly became one of France's most strategic communication assets. Thanks to its height, Eiffel had previously rigged the tower for wireless telegraphy, a move initially made to save it from demolition. That decision ended up giving France a serious tactical edge. During the war, the tower transmitted crucial military messages. It intercepted German radio transmissions and broadcasted French ones. In 1914, when the Germans were charging toward Paris in the early stages of the war, the tower played a pivotal role in halting their advance. It intercepted a message revealing German troop movements, allowing the French to regroup and counterattack at the Battle of the Marne. Yes, you read that right. A tower originally built to impress party guests ended up being a wartime MVP. Eiffel probably grinned smugly from beyond the grave. By World War II, the Eiffel Tower had to pick a side again, but this time, it didn't get much of a choice. When the Nazis occupied Paris in 1940, Hitler demanded that the swastika be flown from the top of the tower. However, the flag, perhaps feeling the same nausea as the rest of France, blew away within hours. Embarrassed, the Germans replaced it with a smaller one, presumably secured with a few extra Heil Hitlers and some string. The French, never ones to take occupation quietly, had already pulled off a delicious bit of passive resistance before the Nazis arrived. Someone cut the tower's elevator cables. If Hitler wanted to enjoy the view, he'd have to walk up the stairs like everyone else. He reportedly declined, which may be history's tiniest but most satisfying victory. Despite the chaos of war, the Eiffel Tower remained standing, and when peace returned, it didn't just stand, it posed, because the 20th century was about to give it a new role. Celebrity, Hollywood, fashion, travel ads, music videos. Everyone wanted a piece of that tall Parisian iron. The Eiffel Tower began appearing in films faster than you could say cinematic cliché. Want to signal romance? Eiffel Tower in the background. It's Paris, Eiffel Tower. We need a European city destroyed by aliens. Eiffel Tower topples first. It has exploded in everything from Independence Day to G.I. Joe, The Rise of Cobra. If there's a blockbuster with international stakes, odds are the Eiffel Tower is somewhere in the middle of it, just waiting to be blown up, climbed dramatically, or lit up with lasers. But the tower's rise in global pop culture wasn't just about films. Music icons danced in front of it. Novels featured it as a dramatic backdrop. And fashion? Oh, don't even get started. Designers used the Eiffel Tower in everything from perfume ads to catwalk designs. It wasn't just a monument anymore. It was a brand, and like any brand worth its weight in Eiffel-shaped souvenirs, replication soon followed. Let's talk about the knockoffs. There's the famous one in Las Vegas, a half-scale replica outside the Paris-Las Vegas hotel, complete with flashing lights, a faux skyline, and tourists posing with martinis while saying, "It's just like the real thing." Spoiler, it's not. Then there's Tokyo Tower, which looks like the Eiffel Tower if it had a color crisis and chose bright red. Built in 1958, it serves a similar function, radio and TV broadcasting, and a similar purpose. Look iconic on postcards. China has several Eiffel Tower replicas, because why have one when you can mass-produce romance? Even theme parks got in on the action. There's one in Shenzhen, one in Islamabad, one in Russia. It's a global Iron family reunion, except only one of them is the real deal. And let's not forget the mini Eiffel Towers that haunt suburban lawns, Instagram filters, and keychains sold by aggressive vendors around the base of the actual tower. But fame has its price, and in the case of the Eiffel Tower, that price is maintenance. A monument of that size doesn't just sparkle on its own. It takes 60 tons of paint to give the tower its signature bronze glow. That's enough to coat the Statue of Liberty several times over, or repaint every regrettable kitchen in the 1970s. And every 7 years the whole tower is repainted by hand. Yes, hand. No spray guns, no shortcuts, just a lot of very patient painters climbing around 18,000 iron parts like polite spider people with brushes. Despite being seen as a cold metal structure, the Eiffel Tower continues to live a surprisingly vibrant life. It glows for national celebrations, mourns in silence with the world during tragedies, and erupts in color during international victories. It has become less a tower and more a global mood ring. And every time it appears in a new commercial or film, it reminds the world that France once built something to show off, and the world never stopped looking. It's not every day a 19th century iron giant becomes a 21st century diva, but the Eiffel Tower isn't just surviving in modern Paris, it's thriving like a socialite at Fashion Week. With over 7 million visitors flooding in each year, Gustave Eiffel's once controversial iron project now plays the lead role in Paris's ongoing love story, with tourism, culture, and highly photogenic landmarks. Let's start with the raw numbers. Over 300 million people have visited the Eiffel Tower since its opening in 1889, and today it averages 20,000 visitors per day. That's roughly the population of a small European town, waiting in line for an elevator, often in the rain. And yet, they come. Rain or shine, selfie stick or not, the tower pulls them in like an iron lighthouse of romance, adventure, and Instagram likes. But behind the sparkling lights and long queues is a surprisingly busy lifestyle. This tower doesn't just stand there looking pretty. It's got a full-time job. Actually, several. It houses 2 restaurants. The elegant Le Jules Verne on the 2nd floor, and the more casual Madame Brasserie. For those who prefer their escargot with a side of vertigo, both offer sweeping views of the Paris skyline, along with prices that gently remind you you're paying for the view, darling, not just the food. And if you need to mail a postcard bragging about your Eiffel adventure, there's a post office inside the tower. Yes, a functioning post office. The Eiffel Tower is officially more productive than most people's home offices. It even has its own postal code, 75007. Sending a letter from inside the tower means your message gets a special Eiffel Tower postmark, which is basically the male equivalent of getting kissed by Paris herself. Still not quirky enough? Okay, try this. The Eiffel Tower also has beehives. No, that's not a metaphor for tourists swarming the elevator lines. we mean actual bees. Up on the first floor, hidden away from the flash-happy masses, are a set of hives quietly producing honey, like it's just another Parisian artisan gig. The honey is harvested and sometimes sold in limited editions, adding yet another item to the list of things the Eiffel Tower does better than you: gourmet bee farming. And the upkeep? Let's just say, maintaining an iron fashion icon takes more than a can of WD-40 and a ladder. The entire structure is repainted every 7 years, a job that takes about 15 months and roughly 60 tons of paint. Workers use brushes and harnesses to individually coat every beam, bolt and rivet by hand. It's meticulous, it's dangerous, and it's oddly poetic, like giving a spa treatment to a skyscraper. You thought your skincare routine was high maintenance? Try moisturizing a 300-meter tall iron lattice in bronze tones. Despite its global fame, not everyone in Paris is swooning over their iron mistress. Some Parisians still grumble about it, like it's an overbearing in-law who refuses to leave. It's too touristy, they say. It blocks the skyline, others argue. And yet, when fireworks erupt from its frame on Bastille Day, or when it glows in national colors after a major event, even the grumblers seem to fall silent, or at least Instagram it before resuming their complaints. Because for all the eye rolls and local fatigue, the Eiffel Tower remains Paris's most unmistakable silhouette. It's the ultimate overachiever of urban landmarks, one that went from architectural scandal to cultural cornerstone, without so much as losing a single bolt. Its image appears on mugs, chocolates, keychains, posters, t-shirts, wedding invitations, and probably somewhere on your aunt's Pinterest board. You don't just see the Eiffel Tower, you feel it. It's shorthand for everything Paris wants you to think it is: elegant, timeless, and just the right amount of extra. Of course, modernity hasn't left it untouched. The Eiffel Tower now has glass floors on its first level, LED lighting systems that allow for dazzling nighttime displays, and even accessibility upgrades to make it more visitor-friendly. Drones occasionally buzz by, and influencers strike poses that would make Eiffel's mustache curl in confusion. Still, it adapts, it survives, it shines. In the end, the Eiffel Tower isn't just a relic. It's a living, buzzing, selfie-snapping, pigeon-attracting steel marvel that continues to reinvent itself. It's been hated, hijacked, climbed, sold illegally, painted, and nearly destroyed, but here it is, standing tall and gleaming as ever, a testament to engineering, resilience, and the very French talent for turning scandal into art. Let's continue to another history story, the birth of Disneyland. Imagine this. It's the 1940s. Walt Disney, beloved creator of talking mice and emotionally scarring animated villains, is sitting on a grimy park bench while his daughters ride a carousel. The air smells faintly of popcorn, diesel fumes, and maybe regret. Around him, the carnival workers look like they just crawled out of a noir film. There are rickety rides, questionable clowns, and no coffee in sight. Worst of all, Walt is bored. This moment, the parental purgatory of waiting while the kids have fun, sparked the multi-billion-dollar idea that would become Disneyland. Walt didn't just want to build a theme park, he wanted to redefine what a park could be. No mud, no rust, no seedy carnies trying to guess your weight. Just clean streets, happy music, immersive worlds, and critically, something for the grown-ups too. It would be a place where everyone had fun. A revolutionary idea, especially in an era when dads were basically expected to suffer in silence at public events. But like any man, determined to build a fantasy kingdom from scratch, Walt was about to face a lot of people calling him crazy, including, awkwardly, his own brother. From carousel regret to castle blueprints. The original concept was modest. Well, modest for Walt. He called it Mickey Mouse Park, and it was supposed to be a little space just across the street from the Disney Animation Studios in Burbank. A few rides, a boat lagoon, maybe a petting zoo. Charming, manageable, slightly rodent-themed, but Walt's ideas had a bad habit of bulking up like a cartoon balloon after a helium overdose. The park quickly grew in his mind. More lands, more rides, more castles. And once you add a castle, well, there's no going back to petting goats. By the early 1950s, Walt had filled entire rooms at the Disney studio with architectural models and design sketches. Animators were quietly tiptoeing around tiny-scale buildings and papier-mâché rivers, like they were in some kind of hobbyist Godzilla movie. One wall of his office had an entire miniature layout of the park. He'd show it to visitors like a proud parent unveiling baby photos, except the baby had a functioning steam train and 6 theme zones. Still, not everyone was convinced. Roy Disney, CFO, voice of reason, professional eyebrow raiser Roy Disney, Walt's older brother, and the money guy behind the Disney empire, took one look at the ballooning costs and whispered, "Absolutely not," probably followed by a longer version that included words we can't air on ABC. To Roy, the idea was a financial sinkhole wrapped in fantasy and sprinkled with cotton candy. It was too big, too risky, too expensive, and crucially, outside the company's lane. They made cartoons, not roller coasters. Besides, theme parks had a reputation for being grimy, dangerous, and legally precarious. Roy didn't want Snow White's lawsuit land on their hands. But Walt didn't just dream big, he persisted big. He started researching parks in secret, pretending it was for the kids, while quietly taking notes on everything from ride efficiency to restroom placement. He visited fairs, amusement parks, even the Tivoli Gardens in Denmark, one of the few clean, well-run parks in the world at the time. While other dads came back from vacation with sunburns, Walt returned with blueprints and a renewed sense of obsessive determination. An entertainment unicorn no one asked for. Hollywood executives were baffled. Here was Walt Disney, the man behind Pinocchio, Fantasia, and Bambi, suddenly talking about immersive themed lands, mechanical submarines, and a full-scale paddle steamer floating in a man-made river. They didn't see a theme park, they saw a nervous breakdown. Walt pitched the idea to everyone who would listen, and a lot who wouldn't. Studio heads said it would tarnish the brand. Financial advisors called it a vanity project. Even his loyal animators rolled their eyes. But Walt was already designing custom trash cans. It wasn't about rides, it was about experience. He envisioned Main Street, USA, not as a stroll through nostalgia, but as an emotional decompression chamber, easing you from the real world into fantasy. He obsessed over how things should feel, how the smell of popcorn should waft through the air at just the right corner, how music should subtly shift as you walked through zones. This wasn't just a park, it was a stage, and everyone was part of the show. The birth of Imagineering before it had a cool name, with no formal field to build on. Walt had to invent a whole new discipline, blending artistic vision with mechanical engineering. He began assembling a team of animators, set designers, architects, and frustrated tinkerers to begin prototyping. The studio's model shop became a war room for ride design. Artists who once animated flying elephants were now calculating ride vehicle speeds and drawing up blueprints for ghost mansions. The term Imagineer hadn't been coined yet, but the spirit was there. Half artist, half inventor, all in. And Walt was already practicing his opening day speech. Building a magical kingdom takes more than dreams. It takes cash. And Walt Disney, bless his imaginative heart, had a lot more of the former than the latter. By the time the concept of Disneyland had ballooned from a modest park across the street to a fully immersive 160-acre fantasy metropolis, Walt's bank account was looking less like a treasure chest and more like the aftermath of a cartoon bank robbery, with a little bag of coins bouncing down the road. In the early 1950s, Walt found himself staring down the terrifying intersection of creative vision and fiscal reality. He had already sunk his own time, energy, and reputation into the project, but now came the real test, convincing anyone, to pay for it. Spoiler alert, most people thought he was insane. First up, the Disney studio execs. Walt figured, hey, they've profited from my talking animals for decades. Surely they'll take a chance on something that isn't animated and has zero historical precedent. The executives, however, were not thrilled. They weren't exactly eager to fund what sounded like a child's drawing of heaven, and their concerns were understandable. The film studio was still recovering from World War II, and animation was finally back on the upswing. The last thing they wanted was for Walt to drag the company into bankruptcy, because he got sentimental at a merry-go-round. Even Roy Disney, Walt's older brother, co-founder, and default financial babysitter, was deeply skeptical. Roy was practical, methodical, and allergic to risk. And Disneyland was one giant neon sign flashing risk in 4 different fonts. But Walt had already decided this wasn't just a nice idea. It was a destiny-level project, so he did what every desperate visionary does when the walls close in. He gambled everything. Walt mortgaged his house. Then, for good measure, he borrowed against his life insurance. That's right. He literally bet his death on this park working out. This wasn't just entrepreneurial optimism. This was the kind of all-in usually reserved for poker tournaments and dramatic movie montages. With no support from traditional studio funding, Walt tasked Roy, the guy who had just spent the last few years trying to stop Disneyland from happening, with making the numbers work. Roy, reluctantly, became the man trying to sell the wildest idea in entertainment history to a bunch of cigar-smoking bankers who thought Disneyland sounded like a new brand of chewing gum. Banks were not impressed. The word theme park in the 1950s came with baggage, cheap thrills, legal liabilities, and a business model built on carnival hot dogs and questionable ethics. They didn't see a family-friendly utopia. They saw a potential lawsuit magnet with mouse ears. Most declined to invest. Then came the wild card television, or more specifically, the fledgling ABC network. At the time, ABC was the underdog of the big three networks. CBS and NBC were running laps around them, both in ratings and prestige. ABC was desperate for content that would stand out, and Walt Disney, beloved, recognizable, and extremely telegenic, seemed like the perfect partner. But Disney didn't just want airtime, he wanted capital. What followed was one of the most groundbreaking media deals in American entertainment history. ABC agreed to fund part of Disneyland's construction in exchange for a weekly television show, conveniently also called Disneyland, that Walt would host. The show would air cartoons, films, behind-the-scenes features, and of course, tantalizing sneak peeks at the theme park. It was a weekly primetime infomercial disguised as wholesome family entertainment. In today's terms, it was the equivalent of launching an entire content marketing empire just to promote your passion project. The show was a hit. Walt would stroll onto the screen, calmly explaining his vision like a suburban wizard, showing viewers maps, models, and magic in the making. Audiences fell in love with the dream, long before the first brick was laid, and ABC got the boost they were praying for. Suddenly, they weren't just a third-string network. They were the exclusive pipeline to the future of family fun. What's more, the Disneyland TV series created a direct emotional connection between the park and its audience. People didn't just want to go, they felt like they were already part of it. Kids across the country knew what Adventureland and Frontierland were before they existed. Parents saw Walt on their screens, calmly selling wonder with a side of Midwestern trustworthiness. The park hadn't opened yet, and it already had a national fan base. The Disney ABC deal also gave rise to the now ubiquitous synergy between entertainment properties and theme park tie-ins. This was long before synergy became a buzzword executives threw around while launching Star Wars-themed cereal. Walt had invented it by accident, or rather by necessity. When you have no money, and no one believes in your vision, you get creative. And Walt Disney was nothing if not creatively broke. By the time construction began, the combination of personal loans, network funding, and sheer charisma had cobbled together enough cash to start building the dream. Barely, but Walt had pulled it off. He'd turned skepticism into sponsorship, risk into reality. Disneyland wasn't just happening, it was being broadcast into living rooms across America. By 1954, Walt Disney had his dream on paper, funding from a skeptical TV network, and a national audience hyped on weekly television teasers. All he needed now was everything else, namely, land. Lots of it, preferably flat, cheap, and sunny enough that tourists wouldn't get rained out while queuing for a pretend pirate ship. Enter Anaheim, California, a sleepy agricultural town nestled in Orange County, where the main attractions were citrus groves, dairy farms, and the occasional cow crossing. To locals, Anaheim wasn't exactly screaming future global entertainment hub, but for Walt, it had a trifecta of gold: open land, moderate climate, and prime location. Disneyland wasn't going to thrive in the smoggy gridlock of Los Angeles or the studio-packed streets of Burbank. Walt wanted space to breathe, enough room for trains, rivers, rockets, and a castle. Anaheim, sitting at the edge of urban sprawl, offered just enough distance to build big without scaring off city folk. But buying land wasn't as simple as pulling out a checkbook. The moment sellers knew Walt Disney was involved, prices would skyrocket like a Space Mountain ride gone rogue. So he did what any shrewd visionary would do. He went undercover. Walt deployed a series of dummy corporations with boring bureaucratic names, like Retlaw Enterprises, that's Walter, spelled backwards, because subtlety is for amateurs, to quietly buy up parcels of land from unsuspecting citrus farmers. While most landowners assumed they were selling to random real estate speculators, they were actually sealing the deal on what would become the site of one of the most iconic destinations in modern history. And then the work began. And by work we mean a full-blown, budget-bending, timeline-punishing, mud-splattered logistical nightmare. The land may have been cheap, but it wasn't exactly ready to host a Victorian carousel, a riverboat, and a rocket to the moon. The soil was dense and hard-packed from decades of agriculture. Water tables were finicky. Existing irrigation ditches had to be rerouted. Construction crews encountered sinkholes, tree stumps the size of Buicks, and one memorable week, where it rained so hard, the whole site turned into a theme park-themed swamp. Despite this, the pace was relentless. Walt had given himself just a year to turn flat farmland into 5 fully functioning themed lands: Main Street, USA, Adventureland, Frontierland, Fantasyland, and Tomorrowland. Think about that, 1 year. Today, it takes 3 years to open a Starbucks in some cities. Walt wanted to build an entire working kingdom in 12 months. The construction itself was a spectacle. Bulldozers took out orange trees by the thousands. Roads were dug, paved, and redrawn. Crews laid railroad tracks while others built tunnels and man-made rivers. Jungle foliage was imported from around the world. And when that wasn't fast enough, local gardeners were called in to paint weeds green to fill the gaps. Seriously, Disney's landscaping budget basically included spray paint and hope. There was also the question of zoning. Anaheim's city planners were deeply confused. What was this man building exactly? Was it a fair, a carnival, a zoo, a city? And what in the name of bureaucracy was a frontier land? Some council members were baffled by things like fake mountains and water rides. One meeting reportedly involved a heated debate over whether a pirate lagoon needed a lifeguard. The short answer, no. But you might want to staff one just in case the pirates get rowdy. Locals were skeptical. What kind of lunatic needed a fake river that looped around a jungle temple? Why was he digging ditches next to horse trails? Some thought the project was a con job. Others assumed Walt was just building a glorified petting zoo. Few understood that he was attempting something America had never seen. A fully immersive, meticulously detailed environment that mixed storytelling with engineering, on a scale that made roller coasters look like training wheels. Every land had its own quirks. Adventureland needed faux exotic plants that looked real but wouldn't die in a week. Frontierland required full-size paddle boats that could actually float down a track-fed river. Tomorrowland was supposed to predict the future, except the future had to be built with 1950s tools and 1950s understanding of rocket science, which is to say, it was more tomorrow-ish than scientifically accurate. And then there were the floods. Oh, the floods. Anaheim's water table didn't care about your magic kingdom. Crews dug out one section for the jungle cruise, only to find it filled back up like a bathtub overnight. Pumps were brought in, barriers were built, sandbags were deployed like military troops. At one point, Walt allegedly stood on site in soaked shoes and calmly said, "We'll call it an underwater adventure." Through it all, deadlines loomed, money ran short, and Walt kept pushing forward, convinced that if he could just get the park open, the rest would follow. He believed Disneyland would be a place where imagination lived, where families could step into stories instead of just watching them on screens. He also believed in working 20-hour days, terrifying engineers with last-minute changes, and walking around construction zones in a sports coat, like everything was totally under control. By the summer of 1955, against all odds, the groves were gone. In their place stood a new kind of frontier, one filled with castles, cowboys, astronauts, and jungle cruises. Walt had taken dirt, oranges, and skepticism, and turned them into dreams. But what happened after the dreams opened to the public? That's where it gets wild. By now, Walt Disney had land, a bit of money, emphasis on bit, and a ticking clock to bring Disneyland to life. But who do you call when you want to build a magical kingdom, unlike anything the world had ever seen? Architects? City planners? Engineers? Logical people? Not Walt. He called the cartoonists. Instead of traditional architects, Walt leaned on the talent he already had at his fingertips: animators, background painters, storyboard artists, and film set builders. These were the people who had been conjuring whole worlds on paper for decades. Why not just bring those worlds to life with wood, steel, and a little cement? Thus was born the team of Imagineers, a term mashed together from imagination and engineer, like the world's most whimsical job title. These were hybrid geniuses who could draw like Da Vinci, weld like a mechanic, and think like a director on a sugar high. Their mission? Build a theme park that didn't look like a theme park, a place where every path told a story, and every trash can was part of the show. Yes, trash cans. We'll get there. First, let's talk about castles. Sleeping Beauty's castle was to be the centerpiece of Disneyland, the heart, the beacon, the Instagram backdrop, decades before Instagram was a thing. But here's the problem. Walt wanted it to look majestic, towering, fairy tale-like, and the budget said, you get 77 feet. That's all. Good luck. So the Imagineers whipped out a bit of movie magic and deployed a technique called forced perspective. It's a visual trick that messes with your brain, making short things look tall and far things look closer. By shrinking the size of windows and turrets the higher they went, they created the illusion that the castle soared far beyond its modest height. It's basically medieval cosplay for your eyeballs, and it works so well that most guests never suspect they're being lied to by bricks. And it wasn't just the castle. Main Street, USA, that charming little American town you stroll through after entering the park, is one giant optical illusion. The buildings on the first floor are normal-sized, but the second floors are slightly smaller, and the third floor facades are downright tiny. It's like a dollhouse grew up and got a mortgage. The effect? Everything feels quaint, cozy, and somehow grander than it really is. Walt obsessed over every single detail. We're not exaggerating. He micromanaged with the enthusiasm of a caffeinated squirrel. He personally dictated the color palette of the park. He debated the placement of benches. And yes, he waged war on litter, an enemy he took more seriously than most Bond villains. One day, he watched how long it took guests to walk from a hot dog stand to the nearest trash can. The average, about 30 steps. So Walt decreed that no guest at Disneyland should ever be more than 30 feet away from a trash can. It's why the park feels unusually tidy, even on the most chaotic days. That's not magic, that's mathematical sanitation. And unlike the sticky, candy wrapper-covered carnivals Walt loathed in his youth, Disneyland would sparkle. He hired an entire crew of nocturnal cleaners who would swoop in after dark and restore the park to pristine condition by sunrise. They were basically theme park elves. And heaven help you if you were a cast member who dropped gum near a planter. You'd get a scolding and possibly a lecture on thematic integrity. But cleanliness was just one piece of Walt's revolutionary vision. The real innovation came in the form of immersive storytelling. Theme parks before Disneyland were just rides and games. Fun, sure, but shallow. Walt wanted you to live inside a story. From the moment you stepped through the gates, you were no longer in California. You were in a turn-of-the-century American town, or a jungle outpost, or a moonlit fantasy kingdom. Every corner was part of the narrative. Imagineers studied movie techniques, lighting, sound design, set transitions, and applied them to physical spaces. Rides weren't just thrill machines. They were chapters in a story. Queue lines were part of the world building. Signage had to match the tone. Even the music that drifted through the air was carefully chosen to match the land you were in. If that sounds normal today, that's only because Walt and his team made it the standard. No detail was too small. The horses on King Arthur's carousel weren't just painted white. They each got names and personalities. The lampposts on Main Street looked like gas lamps but ran on electricity. The popcorn stands were designed to match the land they were in. Even the smell of baked goods near the entrance, not a happy accident. Scent machines were installed to waft the aroma of cookies through the air like an invisible hug. Walt didn't just want people to have fun. He wanted them to believe, even if just for a moment, that it was all real. By the time the park was nearing completion, Disneyland wasn't just a collection of attractions. It was a carefully choreographed theatrical experience, where every building, bench, trash can, and sound effect played a role. Walt had taken storytelling off the screen and into the real world, turning physical space into a new form of narrative. July 17th, 1955. The sun was shining. The banners were fluttering. and the cameras were rolling live across the country. America tuned in, popcorn bowls full, to watch Walt Disney open the gates to his long-dreamed Magic Kingdom. It was a momentous event, broadcast coast to coast to some 90 million viewers, and almost immediately, it started unraveling like a wet napkin in a hurricane. They called it Black Sunday, and boy did it earn that name. The guest list was supposed to be exclusive, just a few thousand specially invited attendees, including celebrities, politicians, and some press. But there was one teeny-tiny problem: counterfeit tickets, thousands of them, printed, sold, and handed out like flyers to a free sandwich shop. Somewhere in Southern California, some entrepreneurial folks realized, hey, Walt Disney probably isn't going to check everyone at the gate personally, and ran with it. The result? More than 28,000 people crammed into a park that was designed for half that number. The plumbing couldn't handle it. The rides weren't ready. The food ran out. And let's talk about the shoes for a second. It was hot, like devil on vacation hot. The freshly poured asphalt, laid just the night before in a desperate attempt to finish the walkways, hadn't properly cured. So when temperatures hit the triple digits, the ground turned into a sticky tar trap. Women's heels began sinking into the pavement, like spoons into warm pudding. Guests were literally stuck in the happiest place on earth. Meanwhile, the drinking fountains weren't working. Because of a plumber's strike, Walt had to make a choice in the final days before opening install water fountains or toilets. He wisely chose toilets. Nobody wants a Frontierland porta-potty situation. But the trade-off meant no relief for thousands of parched guests under the scorching sun. Of course, the media suspected a sinister plot. Disney cut the water to sell more soda. It wasn't true, but the narrative was too juicy to pass up. Inside the park, things weren't faring much better. Some rides flat out refused to function. The Mark Twain riverboat nearly capsized from overcrowding. Autopia cars broke down mid-drive and had to be pushed off the track like sad little soapbox racers. Adventureland's Jungle Cruise, mostly just water, trees, and confused guests waiting for something to happen. Pirates, not even built yet. Then there was the food situation. Davy Crockett's Frontier-themed eatery ran out of food by mid-afternoon, leading to hungry mobs and more than a few tears from overheated children who were promised ice cream, and instead got a long line and a broken soda machine. One little girl reportedly passed out while waiting for a hamburger, which really added a grim tone to Tomorrowland. Oh, and the live broadcast? A logistical train wreck. Cameramen missed cues, celebrities forgot lines, and poor actor Bob Cummings was caught mid-kiss on a ballerina while the cameras rolled. Ronald Reagan, one of the hosts, was seen sweating profusely in a blazer while trying to smile through what looked like a sun-induced existential crisis. The whole thing played out like a sitcom episode, written by gremlins. Walt Disney, ever the showman, kept a smile plastered on his face, like he had been Botoxed by optimism. He darted around the park, offering handshakes, taking photos, reassuring guests, and whispering frantic instructions to staff who were on the verge of emotionally short-circuiting. One employee recalled Walt handing him a broom and saying, "Just keep moving, look busy." It was bad. Objectively, historically, hilariously bad. But here's the strangest part. People loved it. Not the chaos, necessarily, but the concept. Despite everything melting, breaking, flooding, and misfiring, visitors still left with stars in their eyes. The immersive lands, the costumed characters, the soaring castle, none of them had seen anything like it before. Disneyland was real. And even in its most awkward, malfunctioning, sticky-heeled form, it was kind of wonderful. In the days following Black Sunday, newspaper headlines were a mix of praise and polite horror. One headline read, "Disneyland opens, bugs and all." Others were less forgiving, describing it as an overcrowded, overpriced mess. But Walt wasn't fazed. He declared that the park would keep improving, and it did. Staff worked through the nights, systems were repaired, attractions fine-tuned. Within weeks, things were running far more smoothly, and the guests, they kept coming, in droves. Families returned for second visits, school trips were scheduled, and people began planning their vacations around a place where dreams come true. Whatever damage Black Sunday had done to Walt's PR, it couldn't stop the momentum. The idea, that magical, crazy idea of an immersive, joyful place for all ages, was stronger than the asphalt and more enduring than a broken water fountain. Disneyland survived its birth, barely, But like any fairy tale, it had to stumble through disaster before the magic could truly begin. If the guests were living the dream, the employees, excuse us, cast members were sweating, fainting, improvising, and occasionally trying not to strangle a plastic tree. While Disneyland promised fantasy to the public, behind the fairy tale facades and cotton candy clouds was a machine fueled by youthful enthusiasm, questionable wages, and the occasional makeup disaster. Welcome to the backstage chaos of early Disneyland, where the magic was real, but so were the heat rashes. Let's start with the terminology. At Walt's insistence, employees were never just staff. That sounded far too corporate and lifeless. No, everyone from the princesses to the popcorn vendors was a cast member, as if Disneyland were one massive, never-ending stage production. If you were out in the park, you were on stage. Behind the scenes, backstage. You didn't just work a ride, you performed it. Even if that performance involved desperately trying to keep a pirate animatronic from catching fire. This theatrical philosophy shaped everything about cast life. You smiled through blisters, waved through dehydration, and acted thrilled to be Snow White, even if your wig was trying to escape your scalp. It was all about showmanship. But unlike Broadway, this show ran 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, in 95-degree weather, and your co-star was a child with an ice cream cone melting directly into your shoe. Early cast members were a patchwork crew: college students, theater kids, hopefuls chasing stardust, and locals lured in by the novelty of the new park. They got crash courses in Disney etiquette. Always smile, never break character, and for heaven's sake, don't point with one finger. It's impolite in some cultures. Disney employees point with 2 fingers, or the whole hand, a tradition that continues to this day. Training was part customer service, part improv comedy, and part emergency response drill. A jungle cruise skipper might go from cracking jungle puns to helping a fainting tourist before diving back into a crocodile joke, like nothing happened. And the heat? Oh, the heat. You haven't truly known suffering until you've worn a fur-lined Goofy costume in August, while hugging sticky children whose main goal seems to be to punch your snout. Characters regularly passed out. One cast member playing Pluto once collapsed in front of Sleeping Beauty's castle, causing a small child to scream. They've killed the dog. Medics had to rush in, dragging Pluto's limp body backstage like a canine-themed war casualty. Let's not forget the Dapper Dans, the barbershop quartet in pastel suits who serenaded Main Street with perfect harmonies and permanent grins. It looked charming on the outside, but it was a logistical headache. Their mustaches had to be waxed just so. Their voices had to stay pitch perfect, even as they dodged stroller wheels and confused pigeons. And heaven forbid someone had the audacity to cough mid-note. Meanwhile, the Jungle Cruise skippers became Disneyland legends. These were the sarcastic, quick-witted narrators who guided boats past animatronic hippos and fake waterfalls while delivering pun-laden monologues that somehow became iconic. And if you look to your left, you'll see absolutely nothing, because we haven't built it yet. Skippers quickly became cult favorites among cast members, a mix of actor, tour guide, and barely restrained anarchist. Some went off script so much that Walt himself had to reel them back in, but secretly, he loved the chaos. It kept things alive. Costumes were another ordeal. They itched, they baked, they rarely fit. Early makeup protocols were equally punishing, especially for women. Princesses had to apply stage-level cosmetics in outdoor weather. Eyeliner melted, wigs slid, foundation evaporated. Some cast members carried extra powder in their pockets, like soldiers carrying emergency rations. Others simply learned to lean into the glamour of looking like a half-melted candle. And let's not gloss over the pay. Many early employees were paid peanuts, sometimes less than $1 an hour. Disney wasn't shy about expecting perfection while budgeting like Scrooge McDuck. This led to understandable frustration, occasional walkouts, and the rise of something now lovingly known as cast member urban legends, like the one about a haunted mansion butler who got locked in a coffin overnight, or the pirate who kept showing up drunk and started sword-fighting bushes, or the employee who swore they saw a ghost riding Space Mountain. Hey, those 14-hour shifts will do strange things to your brain. Despite all the mayhem, a strange loyalty emerged among the cast. Working at Disneyland in those early years became something between a boot camp and a badge of honor. You suffered, sure, but you also became part of a weird, dysfunctional family, where everyone knew that Tinkerbell was secretly afraid of heights, and Goofy had turf wars with Donald in the break room. Behind the laughter and princess songs, Disneyland ran on sweat, timing, and the unshakable dedication of its earliest employees. They were the ones who turned a chaotic dream into a functioning wonderland. The cast may have been underpaid, overworked, and occasionally unconscious in a Pluto suit, but they believed in the magic, even when it smelled like fried churros and costume glue. When Walt Disney declared that Disneyland would never be finished, he meant it as a philosophy of perpetual improvement, creativity, and innovation. What he didn't say was that this idea also applied to, say, installing safety features on rides after they had already tossed a few guests around, like sock puppets in a tornado. The early days of Disneyland were, quite frankly, a safety inspector's fever dream, and not the good kind. It was a place where seatbelts were optional, maintenance was reactionary, and centrifugal force was apparently a form of entertainment. Let's begin with the grand tradition of opening first, fixing later. Early Disneyland didn't just open with a bang, it opened with the threat of minor whiplash. Take the Matterhorn bobsleds, for example. When it opened in 1959, it was the first tubular steel roller coaster in the world, an engineering marvel. It was also, in its original form, a fully unsupervised alpine trial, where riders bounced around like hockey pucks inside a metal can. There were no seatbelts, no lap bars, no overhead restraints. You were held in by gravity, good intentions, and possibly the pure will of Walt Disney's ghost whispering, "Hold on tight." In the same vein of thrill by chaos, consider the flying saucers. Debuting in Tomorrowland in 1961, this attraction was like bumper cars. If bumper cars floated slightly off the ground and barely worked, guests sat in individual saucer-like vehicles that hovered via bursts of compressed air. In theory, it was futuristic fun. In practice, it was like being trapped inside a malfunctioning air hockey puck, while 12 other people tried to crash into you with joyful abandon. The technology was so finicky, the ride was shut down after just 5 years. It was reportedly more fun to watch break than to actually ride. Then there was the Mad Tea Party, more commonly known as the Teacups, an iconic ride, yes, but also a high-speed dizzy-making centrifuge, cleverly disguised with pastel paint and whimsy. Some early versions spun so violently that guests emerged with a new appreciation for gravity and several regrets about their breakfast choices. One overzealous ride operator allegedly learned how to spin the cups even faster manually, turning what was supposed to be a light-hearted spin into a mild reenactment of a NASA G-force test. And while many of these rides were designed to thrill and occasionally disorient, others just broke, spectacularly. The Autopia cars, for instance, were supposed to give kids the thrill of driving in a controlled, low-speed environment. What they got was tiny bumper cars disguised as sports coupes with minimal braking power and steering that worked best when you screamed at it. Early models lacked even the basic center rail to keep the cars from swerving into each other. Kids crashed into each other gleefully while their parents watched in horror from the sidelines, wondering if this counted as a driving lesson or a lawsuit. But perhaps the most famous oops moment belonged to the original Disneyland Railroad, specifically the Viewliner, a sleek, futuristic mini-train that looked like it had been designed by a 1950s toaster company. Meant to impress with its modern design, it was so underpowered and unstable that the cars occasionally derailed or couldn't make it up mild inclines without help. This cutting-edge train lasted less than 2 years. Turns out, trains are less magical when they can't climb hills or stay on tracks. All of this might make you wonder, where were the safety standards? The answer's still being written. The early years of Disneyland were like a live experiment in trial and error, with a little extra emphasis on the error. OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, didn't even exist until 1971. Before then, safety protocol often amounted to Walt says it's fine. Cast members reported that fixes were sometimes done on the fly, mid-season patches, track changes overnight, and ride re-engineering done with less formality than a high school science project. One Jungle Cruise boat actually sank during testing. The reaction? Welp. Let's try another boat. And guest injuries? They happened. People tripped, slipped, fell, or just outright collided with animatronic objects moving faster than expected. But in those pre-viral video days, Disneyland had a tight grip on PR. Most incidents were smoothed over quietly. First aid was discreet. Apologies were generous. And sometimes, Magical compensation appeared in the form of free ride tickets and a Mickey Mouse plush big enough to smother the trauma. But through all this chaos, Walt's core belief stayed intact, that Disneyland should always evolve. The hiccups weren't failures, they were growing pains. Each ride that shook, spun, or temporarily lost a wheel was a stepping stone to better design, better technology, and yes, better seatbelts. Disney didn't just invent immersive theme parks, he also inadvertently helped push forward the evolution of amusement park safety by, well, testing the limits of how much a guest could be jostled before filing a complaint. Today, the rides are safer, smoother, and considerably less likely to dislocate your shoulder. But the legacy of those wild, loosely bolted days lives on. Every time someone boards a ride and hears that robotic safety announcement, or buckles up with a restraint designed by someone who watched too many teacup incidents in 1956. For most people, Disneyland is a vacation destination. For Walt Disney, it was home. Literally. While millions of guests strolled down Main Street, USA, marveling at the castle in the distance, and the smell of popcorn in the air, Walt Disney was sometimes right above them, peeking out a window, watching them enjoy his creation like a proud and mildly obsessive father. His apartment above the Main Street fire station wasn't just a convenient crash pad, it was a symbol of just how deeply Disneyland wasn't just a park to him. It was a living, breathing, meticulously controlled world, and Walt was its omnipresent, coffee-fueled deity. Let's start with the apartment. Small and modest by Hollywood mogul standards, Walt's hideaway was decked out in early 1900s Americana style. Antique furniture, floral wallpaper, a little kitchenette, and enough charm to make even the toughest studio exec tear up. There was even a fireman's pole, though it was later sealed up after someone actually slid down into the employee area below. Walt used the apartment frequently, especially in the early years when he wanted to keep a close eye on construction, operations, and guests who dared toss gum on the sidewalks. Whenever he was in residence, he'd leave the lamp in the window on, a subtle signal to cast members. The boss is watching, and oh boy was he watching. Walt's level of micromanagement made Steve Jobs look laissez-faire. The man was a genius, yes, but also the kind of boss who might move a trash can 2 feet to the left, just to see if it changed pedestrian flow. Spoiler, it did. He was obsessed with guest behavior. He reportedly once counted the exact number of steps people would take before needing a trash can after finishing a snack, about 30, which is why Disneyland is dotted with so many perfectly placed bins. He adjusted bench locations, tree heights, and even manhole cover designs. If something distracted from the illusion, it had to go. His commitment to the experience extended to sound, smell, and even sightlines. If you're in Frontierland, you can't see Tomorrowland. If you're in Fantasyland, there's no hint of the real world. That wasn't an accident. Walt believed Disneyland should be completely immersive, a place where storytelling didn't stop at the screen. It surrounded you. The theming was meant to be so consistent, so convincing, that you'd forget you were anywhere near Anaheim, and start to believe that talking mice and 19th century train conductors were part of your Tuesday afternoon. And this was no set it and forget it scenario. Walt was constantly walking the park, often unannounced. Employees quickly learned that a man in a fedora might just be the boss himself, dropping by to chat or silently observe. These surprise walkthroughs became legendary. One story goes that a janitor once leaned on his broom for a second, just 1 second, and heard a calm voice behind him say, "Is that broom holding you up? Or are you holding it up?" It was Walt. The broom was never leaned on again. Cast members, a term Walt insisted on instead of employees, understood that Disneyland wasn't just a workplace. It was a stage. Everyone was in character. Every role mattered. Walt's standards were sky high. But not just because he was a perfectionist. He genuinely believed that creating magic required discipline, commitment, and yes, a healthy dose of fear that he might pop up behind a popcorn stand unannounced. But beyond the rules, beyond the relentless tinkering, there was a clear emotional core to Walt's involvement. Disneyland was his utopia. His childhood had been hard, distant father, endless work, and very little play. Disneyland was his attempt to create a world where families could play together, where kids and adults could both laugh, where fantasy wasn't just for bedtime, but for an entire day. And he didn't want to just oversee that dream, he wanted to live in it. His apartment wasn't just convenience, it was communion with the park itself. That's why the lamp in the window above the fire station still glows, night and day. Cast members leave it on in tribute to Walt. It says, he's still here. And in a way, he is. In every red curb, every themed trash can, every carefully hidden speaker blasting atmospheric music, Walt's obsessive fingerprints are everywhere. The park has evolved, expanded, and adapted. But the vision, the immersive, meticulously crafted vision, has never left. Walt once said that Disneyland will never be completed as long as there is imagination left in the world. He meant that the park was a canvas, an evolving story, and like all great stories, it was made personal by the author's presence, watching from above, lamp aglow, silently counting steps between benches, and making sure the popcorn smells just right. In the beginning, Disneyland was the kind of investment that made even seasoned accountants reach for a stressed donut. It cost $17 million to build, an astronomical figure in the 1950s, and by the time the gates creaked open on July 17, 1955, Walt Disney had mortgaged nearly everything short of his mustache. It was, by every rational financial standard, a money pit. But what happened next was something no one, not even the skeptics who scoffed at the idea of animatronic pirates, could have predicted. Disneyland not only survived, it rewrote the rules of entertainment, marketing, and American pop culture. In under a year, it broke even. By the end of year 2, it was turning a profit. By year 5, it was a cultural juggernaut with a cash register. How? Well, it turns out that when you build a meticulously clean, perfectly themed dream world for families, one where kids can meet a life-sized mouse and adults can ride a submarine without getting wet, people show up in droves. And when those people arrive, they buy things. Oh boy, do they buy things. Walt didn't just build a park, he built a merchandising machine. Every ride exit flowed conveniently into a gift shop. Every character encounter ended with a line for plush toys. And suddenly, you weren't just visiting Disneyland, you were taking it home. In fact, Disneyland practically invented the concept of branded souvenirs. Want a pair of mouse ears? Boom. $1.49. Need a Tomorrowland lunchbox? That's another few bucks. By the late 50s, Disneyland was generating merchandise revenue that would make Wall Street analysts whistle through their teeth. But perhaps the most brilliant money-making invention to come out of the park wasn't a toy or a trinket. It was the e-ticket. Originally, Disneyland used a tiered coupon system for rides. Guests purchased booklets containing A through E tickets, with A rides being the simplest, think Main Street vehicles, or the carousel, and E rides being the big boys. Pirates of the Caribbean, the Matterhorn, and eventually Space Mountain. The term e-ticket quickly became cultural shorthand for something exciting, thrilling, and worth the wait. Want to see a rocket explode? That's an e-ticket moment. Fall in love? Definitely e-ticket. And yes, those tickets raked in cash. The more thrill seekers craved top-tier attractions, the more they needed e-tickets, conveniently sold separately. It was psychological marketing jujitsu. People didn't just want the rides, they felt like they were earning bragging rights by conquering them. Meanwhile, Disneyland wasn't just a sensation with families, it was turning into Hollywood's favorite playground. On any given weekend in the late 50s and 60s, you might spot Frank Sinatra waving from the Jungle Cruise or Lucille Ball grinning beside her kids in front of Sleeping Beauty Castle. Presidents came, foreign dignitaries came, reporters from Tokyo, London, and Paris came. Suddenly, it wasn't just acceptable for adults to go to Disneyland. It was trendy, chic, almost patriotic. Television helped fuel the wildfire. Walt's ABC show, Disneyland, doubled as a weekly commercial for the park and its ever-growing cast of characters. Kids watched in awe as Tinker Bell zipped across the screen, and then begged their parents for a trip to Anaheim. The synergy between TV and theme park was revolutionary. Never before had a media company created a physical extension of its brand so powerful that viewers demanded access in real life. Disneyland became more than a park. It became an idea, a blueprint for how entertainment could be immersive, emotional, and yes, incredibly profitable. Soon, cities across the US began dreaming of their own Disneylands, and the term itself became shorthand for any magical family-friendly attraction. But make no mistake, there was only one. And its success wasn't just financial. Disneyland changed the American weekend. Before it, amusement parks were seasonal, regional, and let's be honest, a little shady. Disneyland made them classy. It created the idea of destination entertainment, where families would plan vacations around a single attraction. The park's clean streets, themed lands, and cheerful employees redefined customer expectations. Suddenly, people wanted more than a roller coaster and a hot dog. They wanted a story. They wanted immersion. They wanted a princess and a parade and maybe a robot ghost too. Disneyland also reshaped how Americans thought about nostalgia. It tapped into a longing for a simpler, more idealized past, one with steam trains, Victorian buildings, and smiling faces. It offered a sanitized, happy version of Americana that families could experience together. In a post-war America, hungry for optimism and family time, it was exactly what the country didn't know it needed. By the time Walt passed away in 1966, Disneyland had hosted over 50 million guests. That's not a theme park. That's a cultural revolution with churros. What began as a financially terrifying gamble became the prototype for global entertainment parks. It taught the world that dreams could be monetized. If you're willing to bet the farm, draw a perfect trash can placement map, and maybe sell a few coonskin caps along the way. If Walt Disney were to take a stroll through Disneyland today, with its lightsaber-wielding tourists, mobile app waitlists, and Mickey-shaped everything from pretzels to waffles, he might be bewildered, but he'd also probably grin like a kid with an e-ticket, because Disneyland hasn't just endured the decades, it's evolved, mutated, innovated, and inspired. What started as a slightly unhinged dream built over Onage Groves is now a living organism with international children, spin-offs, and $1 billion merchandising habit. It's more than a theme park. It's a blueprint, a business model, and a cultural force with its own gravitational pull. Let's start with the idea of Disneyland as a prototype. Walt never saw the park as a finished product. He famously said, "Disneyland will never be completed. It will continue to grow as long as there is imagination left in the world." This wasn't just a nice sentiment to slap on a commemorative mug. It was a business plan. The park was a testing ground for ideas that would later become global juggernauts. Disney World, born from the realization that Disneyland didn't have enough room to keep growing. Epcot, originally envisioned as an actual futuristic city before becoming a theme park flavored with global snacks. Tokyo Disneyland, Disneyland Paris, Shanghai Disney. Every one of them owes its existence to that original patch of Anaheim land, and Walt's refusal to let his imagination stay within California state lines. Culturally, Disneyland did something even more extraordinary. It taught the entire entertainment industry how to sell a world, not just a product. Before Disneyland, marketing was about jingles and billboards. After Disneyland, it was about experiences. You didn't just buy a Disney movie, you lived it. You stepped into it. You bought the plush, ate the themed food, took a selfie with it, and then uploaded that selfie so the whole internet could know you'd been there, done that, and bought the $39.99 Spirit jersey. This idea, turning content into environments, reshaped how we consume media. You can see Disneyland's fingerprints on everything from immersive theater to the rise of escape rooms. Even non-entertainment industries have taken notes. Malls started designing experiential shopping. Museums leaned into interactive exhibits. And now every brand worth its salt is trying to create a brand experience, which is just corporate speak for our very own Disneyland, but with fewer churros and more KPIs. The park itself has kept up with the times by embracing evolution like a very polite, animatronic phoenix. You want Star Wars? Boom. Galaxy's Edge appears, with its full-size Millennium Falcon, blue milk, and cast members who refuse to break character even if you ask them where the nearest bathroom is. Pixar, welcome to Pixar Pier, where you can ride the Incredicoaster and then immediately lose your dignity on the spinning Inside-Out ride. Marvel, coming right up. Avengers Campus, complete with Spider-Man flying through the air via robot stunt double. But for all the new lands and high-tech upgrades, Disneyland remains a kind of sacred ground, especially for superfans. And oh, the superfans. There are annual pass holders who can recite every attraction script from memory. Couples who get married in front of the castle. YouTubers who make entire careers analyzing crowd flow and churro economics. Disneyland is no longer just a place you visit. It's a lifestyle, a fandom, and for some, a quasi-religion. For many families, it's a rite of passage. For others, it's a return to childhood. And for a lucky few, it's where they proposed, honeymooned, or spilled their $9 Dole Whip during a parade. And yet, for all the high-tech additions and crowd control algorithms, something remains refreshingly low-tech at its core. The light in the window above the fire station still glows, just as it did when Walt stayed there during construction. That flickering lamp has become a quiet, enduring symbol, a reminder that Disneyland's beating heart isn't just in its innovations but in its imagination. Walt's presence is felt not in the animatronics or fireworks, but in the obsessive details, the carefully placed trash cans, the smell of popcorn on Main Street, the way every land transitions seamlessly into the next. These weren't accidents, they were choices, they were dreams in blueprint form. Today, the park runs on more than magic. It runs on logistics, data, and some extremely committed teenagers in Mickey costumes. The lines are longer, the churros are pricier, and the orange trees are long gone. But somehow, the spirit remains. That same invitation to step out of the ordinary and into the story. Disneyland was never just about fun rides. It was about a philosophy that the world can be reshaped, retold, and redesigned to make room for wonder. And in that sense, it's not a park. It's an idea, one that never stops growing. So whether you're standing in line for Rise of the Resistance, or just reminiscing about your last dizzying ride on the teacups, remember you're part of something that started with one guy, a big dream and a whole lot of financial risk. And somehow, against all odds, the mouse still stands.